So now that we know how to build applications with multiple screens where we can navigate around, be that with tabs or be that with pushing and popping and whatever you need, now that we had a thorough look at this in a complete app, of course, now let's move on to a new app, an app where I will now dive not only into more advanced features or some other widgets which we haven't seen before, which is always nice to learn, but where we specifically will also have a look at state management. And you will learn what exactly this means and which problem it solves. But of course, I kind of already spoiled that before. State management is a concept that helps us with managing our data in our applications so that we don't have to manage everything just in our main Dart file, in our main widget there, but that we can manage this in a more efficient way, both from a code as well as a performance perspective. In detail in this section, we'll therefore have a look at more widgets and UI patterns, because as I mentioned, I think that's always nice to learn. More widgets which we haven't used before, because we will build a real app in this section after all. It's not just a theory section, we'll build a complete app here. But in that app, we'll then also manage our store more efficiently, and you will therefore learn which state management options exist and why you might want to use a different one than we used thus far. By the end of the module, we'll have a shop like this where we can add items to a cart. In that cart, we can also delete such items. We'll have different pages we can navigate between. For example, to also not just add items to a cart, but also place an order, which you then can see on the orders screen here. And all of that is managed with a more complex state management system, which will help us connect all these different pieces of our application to keep track of what we change on which page without passing data around across dozens of widgets and without managing everything in the main Dart file. As I mentioned, we'll build an entire application in this module. We'll build this shop application, a shop where you can both offer your own products as well as shop for products, add them to a cart, and then place an order. Now, for that, we'll need a couple of screens. And one very important screen, which we'll obviously have in this application, where I also then want to have a side drawer, but more on that in a second. One important screen which we'll definitely need is a screen that shows all our products of this shop. And there I want to have a little grid where we can have our products in there like this. Obviously, we'll probably have real boxes and not ugly ones like this one. So we want to have that shop overview screen here in the application where we can simply see a list of the products that exist. I also want to add a feature where we can favorite products with a little heart icon which we can tap. And if we tap it, it gets filled. And then here at the top, I also want to have a filter, some icon which allows me to set a filter to only show favorite or all products. So this little feature here, so that we can filter our products and save them as favorites, that's also something I want to add to this shop. And other than that, of course, if we tap on a product item here, we should be taken to a brand new screen. And on that screen here, where we'll have a back button, on that screen I want to show the image here, probably the title of the product, and then of course the description text and so on. So simply the detail page of every product we have in the shop. Now, one other thing we'll have in the shop is of course a shopping cart. So up here, I want to have that cart icon here, another option in my menu up there. And when we press that cart icon here, of course, I want to go to a new page where I see all cart items. Now, of course, for that, we need to be able to add items to the cart, and adding items to the cart should also be possible either from inside the detail page here, where we have an add to cart button, or directly here. We can decide how we want to do that. But of course, I want to be able to add items to the cart, and when they are in the cart, we can view them here on the cart screen. On the cart screen, we should have some summary at the top where we see the total amount here, total amount of items we have in the cart, so the sum of the values, and then below that probably a list of the individual items where we have the title and then the quantity, something like this. So this is the cart, and obviously on that cart we should also have some checkout button somewhere, which allows us to place an order for the items in the cart. And obviously the cart items here should be deletable and so on. So we should be able to clear them from the cart if we want to. So a shopping cart will be another important part of our shop. Other than that, of course, we want to have orders. And orders can be reached here through our side drawer. That side drawer should allow us to go to the shop, to the orders screen, and also to our products, which we can manage. So our own products, which we want to sell. Now the shop, that's exactly this page up there. The orders, that will be a brand new screen here, where we also have that drawer to, well, go back here to these drawer options. And then in there, simply a list of the items or of the orders we placed, where each order has, of course, a total sum, and which we probably then can expand to see all the items that were part of that order, something like this. So if we place an order here with the shopping cart, then in the end that ends up down there in the orders overview. So that's also something I want to add. Now last but not least, for managing the products here, we'll have another screen in this application, of course. In that screen we also should be able to reach that drawer to go back and so on. And then here in manage products, for one, of course, we see all the products we have here with the images and then the title and so on. And then we have two important options. One option is to edit these products. So these are the products we are offering. So our products. And we can edit them or we can delete them. Deleting should probably present a prompt, "Are you sure?" so that we have a chance of avoiding misclicks. But other than that, pressing delete simply, well, gets rid of the product. Edit, however, just like a plus button, which I want to have here in my top app bar, that should take us to a new screen where we can edit a product. So in there, we should be able to create a brand new product where we enter a title, a description, and so on. So that should all be possible there. In the end, here we can then save this to go back and add the product both to this list here, but also, of course, to the overall shop where it's then presented and where people can buy it. This is the rough overview of the application we'll build. It's a complete application, as you can tell, with a couple of screens and with complex interactions between these screens. We're managing products, for example, in this screen down there. Then we also need products there, but we also need product information here in the orders screen. We need it here in the details screen, and we also need product information in the cart screen. And then we have the cart data, which we of course manage here. We have the order data, which we manage down there in the order screen. And all these complex connections, that is something we'll have to manage, and why we use a different state management system in this module. Because if we would manage all these different kinds of data in the main Dart file and in our main widget there, then we would end up with a very complex main widget, which we would rebuild all the time, no matter what changed, and that's simply not that great. So therefore, we'll have a different state management system, and besides that, and that's also really a core part of this section, we'll of course build a complete application, and we'll learn about some new widgets in there, which we haven't used before. So let's dive right in then. For this application, I again have a brand new application, which is pretty empty, which you find attached, this main Dart file, that's what you find attached. You can simply drag and drop this into a brand new Flutter project. I haven't set up anything here, and this main Dart file is pretty lean. It only has the My App stateless widget and the My Homepage stateless widget, which just shows some center text here. Now, this is our starting point. And of course, there are many places where we could start in this app. We could start with the feature of adding products so that users can add new products. That would make sense because without products, there's little we can display. However, I will start with the product overview screen instead and simply start with some dummy products, and then later we'll replace that with products that we actually added ourselves with the add a new product screen in the app. Now, what we'll definitely need is a couple of different screens and also normal widgets, and therefore I will already create a screens subfolder and a widgets subfolder here. And that's simply something we did before in an earlier module. It allows us to keep our files more organized and understand what's inside our files. Now in the screens folder here, we can add a new file to hold a new widget, and that should be the products_overview_screen.dart file. Because in there, I want to create a products overview widget, which is the widget that should present that grid of products we have in our application. And that's simply my choice here to start with this widget, because I think that's one of the easiest ways of getting something useful onto the screen, which then soon also allows us to dive into state management. For the moment, let's start with a stateless widget in there, create a new stateless widget, which I'll name products overview screen. And as before, of course, we need to import material Dart from the Flutter package here to unlock stateless widget, build context widget, container, all these types and classes. Now in the products overview screen, I want to render a grid of products. And therefore we need two things. We need products and we need the grid. Now, a product in this application will be, of course, an important model, an important thing. And therefore, I'll create a new folder, models, and in there, I want to have a product.dart file to define how a product should look like in this application so that we can build products based on this definition, which simply helps us, then use this product in a uniform way throughout our application. So in there, we can define a product class. And it's, again, a normal class, not a widget. It's just a class because I just want to use this as a blueprint to create objects based on. And how could a product look like? Now, of course, you are free to structure and model this in whichever way you want it. But for this application, a product definitely should have an ID. And I'll mark this as final for now because I expect to get that ID when the product is created. Later down in the course, for example, we'll get that ID because we'll create a product on a server and then we'll store that server-side generated product here in our application. So we'll have that ID when we create the product. We also probably will have a title, and I think a description also makes sense on a product. And other than that, probably also a price, right? Which should be of type double to allow for decimal places too. And also an image URL. Again, here I'll have an image which is stored on a server, which we then display in the application. We don't store it as an asset that's baked into our application bundle, because if we would do that, then we would have to ship a new app version with every new product that was added. And that's of course not feasible at all. So we'll have a network image here. And there's one last field which I want to have, and that's a Boolean is favorite. And this is not final because this actually will be changeable after the product has been created. And it allows us to track whether the user of this application has this product as a favorite product or not. And later we'll still be able to save different favorite statuses for different users of our app. But that's simply something we'll worry about later. For now, we just have this changeable, this mutable Boolean property here is favorite in this app. Now we need a constructor to initialize a product. So let's repeat the class name here to add such a constructor. And as always, it's up to you whether you want to use named or positional arguments. Since we have a couple of arguments here, I think it's easier to work with this class if we use named arguments. So I'll use curly braces here around my argument list to add these arguments as named arguments. And then I want to be able to set the ID. I want to be able to set the title, the description, the price, and the image URL, and of course also is favorite. Now there are a couple of fields, a couple of properties which I want to mark as required so that we can't create a product without them. And for that, we can use the required decorator, which we can import from the Flutter package, and there the foundation.dart file. With this import added at the top here, we can add required in front of the ID, because that ID will be required, in front of the title, in front of the description, the price, and the image URL, but is favorite is not necessarily required. We can simply initialize that with a default value of false by assigning a default value here. With that, the product class is finished. Looks quite good to me. And with it, we can move back to the Products Overview widget to start our work on the Products Overview grid. Let's actually start by adding a couple of products. And for that, I'll import from my models folder and there my product.dart file to unlock that product class here in this Products Overview widget. And then here in our Products Overview screen widget class, I want to add, since it's some dummy data for now, a final property which will hold a list of products, which I'll name loaded products or whatever you want to name it. And that will be a list of, well, products, as I already said. Now, for this, I prepared some products which you find attached. You can simply add them here or replace your existing products list with these products. Simply some dummy products, which you can, of course, change. You can add more products if you want to, so that we have some products to start with in this widget. And these products satisfy my product definition defined here in the product class. With the products loaded, here in the build method, I, of course, don't want to return a container, but actually a scaffold. Because remember that this widget here, the Products Overview screen widget, will be used as a screen in this app, which means that it will fill the entire screen here. And therefore, it should also provide an app bar, a background color, and so on. And that's all something scaffold does. So I'll use a scaffold widget here and add the app bar argument, which is simply a widget created with the app bar class. And there we can set up a title, like my shop, if that would be the name of our brand, of our shop. Of course, should be a text widget though. So that's something we can add here, like this. And besides the app bar, obviously we want to have a body in the scaffold, and that should be the grid view. And therefore I'll use grid view, but now not in the way we used it before, by instantiating like this and providing a children argument, but instead I'll use the builder method, which works in the same way as list view builder. It simply optimizes longer grid views with multiple items, or where we don't know how many items we'll have, by simply only rendering the items that are on the screen and not rendering the items that are not on the screen. And this helps us with performance for very long grid views, which our list of products potentially could be. So that's the grid view builder here. And the grid view builder now takes a couple of arguments. Now, one of them is the padding, which we can add. And I want to add some padding here with edge insets all 10.0 to make sure there's some padding around the grid. And now you learned earlier in the course that you can turn this into a const here, use a const keyword in front of this to make sure that this does not rebuild when this whole build method is called, which can save you some performance. And that is true, and definitely add const in all places where you can add it. I will not focus on it in this module here because I want to, well, focus on the new widgets and then on the state management part, which is the heart of this module. Now, of course, feel free to add const in all the places where you can add it. As you learned, this is never a bad practice for applications and can help you with performance. But with that, back to filling this grid view, padding to have some padding around the grid. And then we also need 3 other items here, 3 other arguments. One is the item count, which simply tells the grid view how many grid items to build. And that, of course, should be our loaded products and there the length. So how many loaded products do we have? Then we need the item builder, which is a function or which holds a builder function, which receives the context and the index of the item it's currently building a cell for, that should return the widget that gets built for every, grid item we have. So this is actually what we'll see on the screen. Now I'll come back to this in a second. Because there is another argument which we have to provide, and that's the grid delegate. The item builder defines how every grid item is built, how every grid cell should be built. The grid delegate allows us to define how the grid generally should be structured, so how many columns it should have, most importantly. And we set that by providing a sliver grid delegate, and then here I'll use with fixed cross axis count, which means I can define that I want to have a certain amount of columns, and it will simply squeeze the items onto the screen so that this criteria is met. The alternative would be the sliver grid delegate with fixed extent, which we used earlier in the course, where we can define how wide every grid item should be, and it will then create as many columns as it can for the given device size. It simply depends on your app requirements what you want. I simply want to show both, and therefore here I'll not set a fixed width of all the grid items, but instead say I want to have at least a certain amount of grid items on the screen. Now for that, we have to configure this sliver grid delegate with fixed cross axis count class, which is really a cool class name. And one thing we have to configure here is the cross axis count, which is exactly that amount of columns I want to have. And here, let's say I want to have 2 columns. And then you can set the child aspect ratio, and there I want to have 3:2. So they should be a bit higher than they are wide, a bit taller than they are wide. And then you can set up the cross-axis spacing, which is simply the width, the spacing between the columns. And I'll set 10 here, 10 pixels. And the main axis spacing, which is the space between the rows, and I'll set the same spacing there. So with that, we define the structure of the grid. Now we can go back to the grid items that we want to render. Now we could definitely add the widget subtree for each item here, but since this is a perfect scenario for outsourcing something into a separate widget to keep this widget tree of this widget here smaller, I'll create a new widget in the widgets folder, and I'll name it product_item.dart. And in there, a stateless widget, which is also named product item. And this will be the grid item, which gets rendered for every product. Now, of course, here we have to import material Dart. And now we simply have to define how a grid item should look like. Here we could return a container, which we now style ourselves. We could return a card. But I'm always a fan of showing you new widgets which we haven't seen before, and therefore here I'll return a grid tile. That's a widget built into Flutter. You might remember list tile, which we also used in the list view, but also, for example, in the side drawer. Now grid tile is simply a built-in widget which can be used anywhere, but which works particularly well inside of grids. Now a grid tile takes a child, and that will be the main content of the grid. Now here, I want to have an image as the main content. And that will be the image of the product we're rendering. So here, I'll use image.network to create an image widget that takes a network source. And here we could enter a URL, but of course I don't want to have a hard-coded widget, but I want to get that data from outside, so from the place where I use the product item widget. So we'll need to accept a couple of properties in this product item to display a product. Either we have only one property, which is our product of type product, or the separate things that we need from the product as separate properties. And that's the approach I'll take here. So I expect to get the ID, let's say. I expect to get the title, because I'll probably need that. I expect to get the image URL. And yeah, that should be it for now. Now, of course, to really get values for these properties, we need to provide the constructor here. And then again, it's up to you whether you want to use positional or named arguments. I'll use positional arguments, so I'll simply add these 3 property assignments here as arguments in the constructor of the product item. And with that, we get access to the image URL down there. This allows us to render such product items. Let's now use that widget in the products overview screen widget. So in there, let's import from the widgets folder the product item.dart file. And with that import added, down there in our item builder of the grid view, we use product item, and now we simply have to forward the data. So since we go through all our loaded products here, or since the grid view builder does that for us, we want to forward loaded products for the index we're currently building our item for. And then here the ID. Then the second argument product item takes us the title. So let's access loaded products i.title. And then also loaded products i.image URL. These are the three arguments we forward to product item, and therefore product item will now work correctly. Now, one important note, of course in this module we'll have a look at our state management solutions. And one goal there will be that we don't manage all our state in the main Dart file and pass all the state as arguments to our widgets. Passing data into a widget like this, however, is and will always be normal. You want to have reusable widgets which you could drop anywhere into your application and which you then simply configure through or via arguments which you pass to them. So a product item that receives the data it needs to display the content correctly as arguments, that's something we'll always use in our applications. The things we'll later take care of are the unnecessary arguments where we pass something to a widget just because we then need to forward it to another widget and so on, which we also had earlier. But I'll come back to that once we do dive deeper into the state management part. So for now, let's simply pass the data here to product item, which should render it. And with that, let's save it and do a full restart here and see whether that works. However, for that, of course, in main Dart, I first of all have to make sure that I delete my homepage class here and that we actually do render the products overview screen here as our main screen. So I can import from the screens folder and there from the product overview screen Dart file. And with that import added here down there, I want to, of course, use my products overview screen widget as the main widget. Now with that, we can save this. And now indeed here, I see these 4 items, which are my 4 images for the 4 products I provided. It's a start. Obviously, not the prettiest application we ever saw, but it is a start. And it's something we can build up on. So let's now fine-tune the product items here a bit. And for that, let's not just return a boring grid tile with only an image, but let's add more to that than just the image. First, however, I want to configure that image with the fit argument, which you can provide, to take up all the available space it can get. And I do this with box fit cover, which is the setting I want to use here. And if we do that, then this already looks a bit better because now these images at least are equally sized. By the way, this list, of course, would be scrollable here if we had more products that would exceed the boundaries here of this screen. Now on the images, of course, it would be useful to also display the title of the product because that's certainly an important piece of information. For that, besides the child on the grid tile here, we can also add a footer that will add a bar or a part at the bottom of the grid tile. And there is another widget which helps us with nicely displaying content there. You don't have to use it, but you can use it, and that's the grid tile bar. Now the grid tile bar can be configured, of course, in various ways. And for example, you can add the title argument here. The title argument takes a widget, and typically that, of course, is a text widget, but you could add anything which suits your requirements. And in there, I want to display the title of our product. So I'll use that title property, which we are receiving here and which we do store in the title property. So I'll use that. And on that text, I also want to make sure that we center this with text align and then text align.center, which is an enum value to tell Flutter to, well, center this text in its widget. And with that, if we now save this, we got that title down there as well, which is quite nice. Now, of course, for example, here for the trousers, this title is a bit hard to read. And therefore, the good thing is that on the grid tile bar, we can also set a background color. Now here, let's try colors gray as a hard-coded color. And we could work with something like this, but I rather have a color which has some opacity to it. For that, we can, of course, use something like black 54, which is a black color that is a bit opaque where you can still see the image. And I think that looks a bit nicer, so I'll go with that. So with that, we now have the title, and we can also read the title. Now on this header, or on this footer here to be precise, I want to have more than just a title though. There also should be buttons to favorite this or to add it to the cart. So in the footer here, we can also add a leading argument to define a widget that should be placed at the start of this bar. Now, the title is always in the center. We can also add items here on the left and on the right to it. So here with leading, I want to add an icon button here because, well, it should be pressable and it should only display an icon, hence it's an icon button. And the icon I'll use here is an icon widget. And there I want to use, icons dot, let's say, favorite. And also add on pressed and set this to an empty, or to a function that does nothing at the moment. With this, we add this heart icon here on the left, which is quite nice. Let's now also add an icon on the right here with trailing still on the grid tile bar, and there another icon button where the icon is an icon widget where we can use the shopping cart icon, and then also add on pressed on the icon button, which for now is a function that does nothing. And if you save that, you see also the card icon here. Now with that, it's taking shape. Let's next worry about our theme and some styling for this application. We can certainly improve the styling of this app. And for this, let's go into the main Dart file and work on the general theme there. Now, I don't want to set up an overly complex theme, to be honest. We did a lot of theming in earlier modules. I just want to use a different primary swatch and also use an accent color. My primary color will be purple here, and my accent color will be deep orange, but again, you can, of course, use any styling you want. What I also want to do, and what we did before too, of course, is add a custom font. So for that, as before, let's add a new folder. I'll name it Assets, and in there I want to have a fonts folder, and attached you find a zip file with fonts you can drag and drop into there. 3 fonts, or 2 fonts, but 3 different styles, Lato and Anton. And as before, we have to register those in the pubspec.yaml file to use them. So in the pubspec.yaml file, go to the part where you see some dummy font setup, comment that in, and then define these fonts. We have Lato, for example, and we find it in the assets folder and there in the fonts folder. And there we have Lato regular and Lato bold. So let's add both here, fonts, Lato bold. These are the paths and the file names. And this is not style italic, but instead it has a weight of 700. And let's add another font family now below that, and that's the Anton font, where we only have one version. The name of the file there is Anton regular, so let's use that here. Oops, Anton regular, and we don't need to define a weight there. So these are the fonts I want to add, and I want to use Lato as the main font in the application. So in the main Dart file, when we define the theme, we can set up the font family and set it to Lato to use this font. And with that, since we added fonts, let's actually quit this application and do a full rebuild and restart so that these fonts are included now. And once this finished, we should have different colors, and we also should have some, a different font in there. And indeed, we do have that. Now I want to change the icon colors here as well. So on the product icon, here on both icon buttons, we can set the color, and here I want to use theme off, and then off context, of course, and use my accent color here, which is this deep orange. And I'll add this to the other icon button here as well, like that. So now with that, we have orange buttons here. And maybe we can now use a slightly darker black here. Less transparent black. Black 38 maybe. Whoops, less transparent. So black 87 maybe. Yeah, I think that looks better. So now we have these icons here, which we can press and which allows us to add items to the cart or to mark this as a favorite, which of course doesn't work right now. And with that, our grid tiles are taking shape. I now also want to have rounded corners, and the grid tile itself has no argument that would allow us to set rounded corners. However, we already covered earlier in the course what we can do in such cases. Do you remember? We can wrap the widget where we want to add rounded corners with a new widget, and the new widget is clip R rect, which simply forces the child widget it wraps into a certain shape. And therefore on clip R rect, we can now define the border radius because that is a widget. Clip R rect is a widget that helps us with clipping a rectangle to add rounded corners, because the R here stands for, well, it stands for clip rounded rectangles. And therefore this is the shape it forms, or it forces on every child widget. And therefore here we can set up the border radius. We do this by setting this to border radius dot circular, maybe a value of 10 then. Now we have some rounded corners here, which doesn't look too bad in my opinion. Of course, if you wanted to, you could also wrap the image here in our grid tile here into a container with a border or a background color or a drop shadow if you wanted to change these items even more regarding their styling. I'm happy with that look here, however, so I'll leave it as it is. Don't want to spend too much time on this. And instead, let's now get closer to that state management thing, because the next steps will be to make this favoriting feature work. And of course, I also want to add a detail page and then a cart where we can add items to. And that will require us to rethink the state management. So let's work towards these features. Let's start with the product detail screen, where we can tap on a product and we see more information about it, like for example its price and its description. Now obviously you might want to show the price here on the starting page as well. You could, for example, also go to your product item, and besides a footer there on the grid tile, you can also add a header so that you could have the title of the item up there and the price down there. These are all changes you can of course implement. I will simply also, for demo purposes, show some of the information here on the main screen and then some on the detail screen. You learned all the tools it takes to fine-tune this to your personal likings and requirements. So my goal now is that we can tap onto a grid tile here, and then we're taken to that detail screen. And for that, we need to add a new screen, of course, add a new file therefore, and that's the product underscore detail underscore screen.dart file, which will hold the stateless widget, which is the product detail screen widget. And therefore, of course, as always, we should import material Dart from the Flutter package up there. Now, since this widget here will in the end render a screen, so it will control the full page, I want to use a scaffold widget here to, well, add an app bar, add a background color. And here in the app bar, I of course want to render an app bar widget, and there I want to output a title with the name of the product. Now we got two ways of managing this now, and that is now already getting closer to that state management idea. You learned in the section where we also focused on navigation and different screens and so on, that there are two important ways of going to a new screen. Here in the products overview screen, when we tap one of our product items there, or therefore here in product item where we can register such a tab, we can either use navigator push and then create a material page route on the fly and create the widget we want to go to on the fly and pass all the data we need to it in place, or we push a named route. Now let's start with pushing on the fly, so to say, which is relatively easy. to implement in this app here. And for that, let's say whenever we tap on the image, we want to go to that new screen. We want to go to the details. And therefore, we can wrap this here with a gesture detector. The image here is wrapped with this widget because that allows us to add on tap listener to this image. The image itself has no on tap argument, but we can easily add one by wrapping the invisible gesture detector widget around it. So on tap should now push this new page. And therefore here in this function which we define, in this anonymous function which we define for on tap, we can use navigator of context push. Not push named, but just push. And there you learned in the navigation section that you create a material page route, which is a widget built into Flutter, which takes a builder method, which gives you a new context object, and which has to return the widget you want to go to. So here, we might want to go to the product detail page, to the product detail screen. So for that, let's import the, from the screens folder, the product detail screen. And now we have that widget available here. So here we can then create a product detail screen like this. Now this is one way of doing it. And when the product detail screen now requires data like the title, then we can simply expect the title here as a property and therefore as an argument in the constructor, where we then simply store it in the property. And then we can reference this title property here in our widgets. And that should of course be a text widget with the title as a content. So now we can use the title property here in this text widget as a title for the app bar, because we're getting the title in the constructor of the product detail screen, because when we push, we do it here on the fly in the place where the user tapped on something, like in this case here on the image. And here, since we're in the product item widget, we already know the title of the product, and we can now forward this here as an argument to the product detail screen. And with this approach, if we do that, now we can tap on these images and we load these different screens with the correct title in the app bar, as you can tell. Now this approach has some benefits. It's relatively easy. We forward the data we already have and we're good to go. Downsides of this approach are that we create this route on the fly here in this anonymous method, and therefore if this application gets bigger and bigger and we have multiple such on-the-fly route creations, it can be hard to understand which different routes and screens our app has if we're new to this app, if we're a new developer. Named routes, which are all registered here in the main Dart file, are much easier to understand because there we have that routes table and we simply see which routes our app has. And that's simply easier than if we have to manually go through all the files to find all these on-the-fly route creations. Another downside is that, of course, it's convenient to pass the data we already have here to the product detail screen. But what if we also need the price here, which we actually do need here? Then I also expect to get the price. And now all of a sudden, we request some information, we need some information, which we don't have here in our product item widget. We don't have the price of the product here. Now, obviously, we could expect it here as an argument, and then we could pass it into the product item widget from inside our products overview widget, where we, of course, have all the products, including their price. The downside about this approach is that we then pass data into product item, which we don't directly use there, which we don't display there, which we only need because we want to create a new screen in here. We want to create that on-the-fly route in here. So we're in that scenario where we pass data as arguments, which we don't really need in the widget, but which we need in another widget where we want to forward it. And that's exactly what we typically want to avoid. So here we already see a problem with this approach. It would be nicer to have a named route, and therefore here in the product item, we could simply use push named and simply pass in the name of our route here. And therefore on the product detail screen, instead of getting this as arguments, I would rather extract that value here from my routing arguments, as you learned it in the navigation section. And for now, I don't have that, so that I can still compile. I'll turn this into some hard-coded text, just so that I don't get errors whilst this compiles. We'll turn this back into a dynamic title later. So instead of getting or having properties which we get as arguments in the constructor, it would be nicer to retrieve arguments from our routing action, so to say, and use this page here, this screen, this widget, as a named route. And therefore, we can, of course, have a static const route name or route path here, which could be product detail, so that we can use this in our main Dart file here in the route table. Because then here we can import from the screens folder the product detail screen Dart file, and then register this as a named route here. Use the product detail screen and there the route name, this static const, which is a string, as a key in this map. And then the value is this builder function where we get the context. We get that by Flutter when it calls the builder function when we call push named. And here we build the product detail screen. And now we have a clean way of seeing which routes we have. We have the overview screen and we have the detail screen. And now when we call push named here, we refer to the product detail screen route name, and now we can set some arguments. And the argument here should, of course, now not be an object or a map with the price, the title, and so on, because then we would still need all that data in the product item widget, which is exactly what I want to avoid. But instead, we could, for example, only forward the ID so that we can fetch all the data we need in the product detail widget inside of the product detail widget. So here in the product item widget, which is that grid item, there I only forward the ID here, which is a property which I do have. I forward that ID here to my named route, not all the data I need there. And now in that named route, I want to extract that ID, which we can do with modal route of context dot settings dot arguments. This will in the end give us the ID, because I forward the ID as my argument, as my only argument here. And now here, I want to get all my product data for that ID. And that, of course, won't work if we always pass data just through constructors. Instead, now we need a central state management solution. So to make this really clear again, what's our problem here? The problem is that in bigger apps where we have a lot of widgets, and of course potentially way more widgets than I have here on this slide, when some child widget needs some data, we typically have to manage that data in our topmost widget, in the My App widget here, because different places of the app need the data, and therefore we have to use the common denominator so that we can pass data through the constructors of widgets, because that is how we typically distribute values or data right now. We pass them as arguments to our widgets, and that can lead to very long chains of here's an argument, please forward it, here's an argument, please forward it, where we pass data through widgets that don't care about it just because some child widget cares. And that's a problem we want to fix with state management, because it can be cumbersome and difficult to pass data through constructors, and besides that extra hassle as a developer, which we don't want to have, it can also impact our application performance. Because if we manage everything in the main Dart file and there in our main widget, or in a couple of root widgets, then these widgets rebuild whenever anything in that data changes, and therefore the entire widget tree rebuilds, even if only one small child widget somewhere in the tree is really interested in the updated data. Take our navigation example from the previous sections, where we built our Meals app with some extra navigation in there. We're managing all our meals data, and that includes things like which are the favorites of the user and which filters did the user set. All that data is managed here in the main Dart file. And the downside is that in here, we basically rebuild all widgets which we render here. So all the widgets we routed to, we loaded as screens. We rebuild these widgets whenever anything changes here. If you add a meal as a favorite, or if you change your filters, then the entire app rebuilds, even the parts that are not affected by this. If you, for example, add a meal as a favorite, that doesn't impact your filters, and still that part of the app would also rebuild. So the constant rebuilding of everything is of course not great for performance. You only want to run the build method in the widgets that really depend on the data that changed. And you don't want to rebuild the entire app just because you changed some data which is required in some parts of your app. So that's one annoying part. The other annoying part is what you see down there. We're passing all the data as arguments to our widgets. Here I'm passing the favorite meals to the tabs screen. The tab screen itself does not need the favorite meals. We only need the favorite meals in the tab screen here because we then forward them to the favorites screen. And that's exactly what I also meant. Besides the performance thing and so on, we're forwarding data through widgets. And that means that whenever we add a new widget in between, then we also have to accept the data there and forward it. If we change something, we have to change the arguments we receive. It's really cumbersome to manage this, and it's not really efficient or the way we want to do that. Hence, we need a better way of managing our state. And for that, let me first clarify what state and state management really means. In Flutter applications and in front-end applications in general, it's always about managing data and the user interface that reflects that data. When your data changes, something typically changes on the user interface, because your user interface really just reflects your data in the end. But data is a broad term here. Data can be anything. It can be the products you show in your app. It can be something like, is this product a favorite of the user, or is this user logged in? And it's this data we also refer to as state. State is simply data which affects the user interface and which also might change over time. So something like, are we currently loading new data? Well, if that changes, you probably want to show a loading spinner on the user interface. So that information is also a piece of data that affects your app, your UI, and which therefore would be labeled as state. The user interface in the end is just a function of your data or of your state, which means if your state changes, the user interface changes. Now for state, you have a couple of different kinds of state, and that's not a hard separation you have to learn. It's just helpful for understanding what I mean when I say state. We have application-wide state, and we have widget or local state. Now app-wide state, as the name suggests, affects the entire application, or at least large chunks of the app. And examples here would be the authentication status of a user. Is the user authenticated? If the user is not authenticated, we typically want to show a totally different app. We want to show a login screen instead of our products. But the loaded products themselves could be data that is required in many parts of your app. Maybe not in every part, but you need the loaded products in the products overview, in the product details screen, also maybe in parts of your shopping cart screens. So these are pieces of data which you need in many places of your app or which have an impact on the entire app or on large chunks of the app. And widget or local state, on the other hand, is really just state that affects only a widget on its own and does not affect other widgets. And a typical example here would be a loading spinner. Should I display a loading spinner in this widget? This piece of information does probably not affect any other widget, but it's important for this widget and what you display in there. Or when you manage form input, so text input the user enters. Things like, is the data the user entered valid, or are there errors in the data the user entered? That's really only relevant to this widget because you might want to show an error message there. It's not relevant to a totally different part of your app. So these are roughly the categories of state which you can differentiate, and state in general is really just data in your app which changes and affects your UI. So now that we understood the problem and what state is, how can we solve it? How can we manage our state differently than just in our main widget in the main Dart file? Now, a pattern which is recommended by the Flutter team and which is really popular and also easy to learn is the provider pattern, which is added by adding a certain package to your app, the provider package. So how does this work? The idea here is that you have a central store or data container in your app, a data provider, that's why it's called provider, which you attach to a widget in your app. And that doesn't have to be the root widget. Here it is, but it doesn't have to be the My App widget. It can be any widget. As soon as you added your provider, so this data container, to a widget, all child widgets of that widget can listen to that provider, but without passing the data through their constructors. Instead, they can add a listener with this off-context trick by using this inherited widget, which I mentioned earlier, which is a widget built into Flutter, which we haven't used directly, but which this provider package uses indirectly to establish a direct communication channel between your widget that needs some data and that data container, which is attached to a totally different widget. Now, the build method for that widget where you attach the listener to, or where you added the listener to, then runs whenever the state in that data provider changes, but only the build method of that widget where you listen to the change runs. So if in our data provider here in this picture, if the data in there changes, let's say the list of products we loaded, then we'll not reload or rebuild all widgets we have here, but instead in this picture here on this slide, we would only run the build method in the single product widget, because the single product widget in this picture here is the only widget that set up a listener to our data provider. Now, as I mentioned, you can have multiple providers in the same app, multiple data containers, and you can attach them to different or to the same widget, and it doesn't have to be the root widget. So you could have a card provider here attached to the card, and then you can also have multiple listeners to one and the same provider, which also, of course, are then set up on different widgets that need that listener. And all these widgets will rebuild whenever this provider or the data you store in it, updates, whenever you update the data stored in that provider, in that container, so to say. That's the provider package and how you use it in theory. Let's now use it in practice to manage our products there. If you search for Flutter provider, you should end up on this page here on pub.dev with the provider package. And there you find some documentation about how to use it, definitely interesting. But of course, that's now also what I will do together with you. We will start using it. And for that, you first of all have to install it, which you do by simply copying this entry here in the installing tab on the package page. Now go back to your project, and there in the pubspec.yaml file, add this entry below your Flutter dependency here, and make sure the indentation is correct, because indentation matters. Once you save that file, Flutter should automatically go ahead and fetch these packages. If it doesn't do that, you can run flutter packages get in your terminal navigated into this project folder. With that, the provider package is installed, and of course the question is now, how do we use it? Now, a provider, in the end, needs to be defined with the help of a class, and you then build a new provider based on that class definition. Now, a provider, or this class you create, is also often referred to as a model, because you also kind of model your data there, the data in your app, which then changes. Now, I'm already using the term model here, though, and I'm using it here to define my data classes, my data types, which I have, like a product here. And that is not really something I want to provide, because a single product is just a single object I use. What I want to manage here with this state management solution is something bigger, a list of all my products, not just a single product. Now, therefore, I will create a new subfolder here and name it providers to set up my classes that define these bigger state management definitions, these bigger data definitions for my app, so to say, the data which also changes over time and which I want to reflect. So here in providers, I'll add a new file and name that products.dart. You can also name it products_provider if you want to make that differentiation really clear. Now, in the products.dart file, you define a new class, and I'll name that class products. However, now here, you don't just have a class like this. Instead, you need to add a mixin. I mentioned mixins earlier in the course already. You add mixins by adding the with keyword and then the name of the mixin. A mixin is a bit like extending another class. The core difference is that you simply merge some properties or some methods into your existing class, but you don't really turn your class into an instance of that inherited class. It's a bit like inheritance light, so to say. And the class we need to mix in here is the change notifier class, which is built into Flutter and which you enable by importing the Flutter material Dart package here. Change notifier is basically kind of related to the inherited widget, which the provider package uses behind the scenes. An inherited widget, whilst we won't work with it directly, is simply a widget in Flutter which allows us to establish behind the scenes communication tunnels with the help of the context object which we're getting in every widget. So this products class now mixes in the change notifier here, and you'll see why we add this mixin in a second. Now you can define whatever you want in this class, and here I want to define a list of products. So I'll first of all import my product model, only with one slash here. And I'll store a list of products here in the products class. So I'll have a list which will hold product data in the end, and I'll name this underscore items. You could also just name it items. I just want to make it really clear that this property here should never be directly accessible from outside. And I'll also show why I do this in a second. So I have my underscore items in there, and that's not a final list because it will change over time. And with that, I mean the value here in the items property, not just the items in the list, because as you learned, you can also change items in a list that is final, but here I really want to change the value that's stored in the property itself. Before we change anything, however, let's actually make sure we can fetch these items. And since I turned this into a private property by adding the underscore, which means it can't be accessed from outside, I'll add a getter here, which will return a list of products. And then it's a getter by adding the get keyword, which is named items without the underscore. And in there, I return my items, but not like this. Instead, I return a copy of them, which I do by wrapping items here into square brackets and then by using the spread operator. Now, why am I doing this? You have to remember that all these objects in Flutter and in Dart are reference types. If I would return my items list here, then I would return a pointer at this object in memory, right? That's what you learned earlier in the course. And that means that anywhere in the code where I get access to my products class here and where I then get access to the items, I get that address and therefore I get direct access to this list of items itself in memory. And hence I could start editing this list of items from anywhere else in the app where I tap into this products class. I don't want to do that. And I don't want to do that because when my products change, I actually have to call a certain method to tell all the listeners of this provider, remember the slide, you have the provider and you have listeners, that new data is available. So let's say we had an add product method here, which returns nothing, and which for the moment doesn't take an argument. And then here, we would simply add something to our items. Then, of course, we typically would have the problem that if we change data here in this class, how would we let all our widgets, or the widgets that are interested, know about this? And that's why we add this change notifier, because that gives us access to a notify listeners method. Because always keep in mind, this class will soon be used by the provider package, which uses inherited widget behind the scenes. And therefore, it will establish a communication channel between this class and widgets that are interested for us. And we need to let those widgets know about updates that we did with notify listeners, so that in these widgets, which are listening to this class and to changes in this class, are then rebuilt and do actually get the latest data we have in there. And that's why I return a copy, so that we can't directly edit our items here from anywhere else in the app, because if we would do that, We could not call notify listeners because we can only do this from inside this class, because there we added this mix in. And hence, our widgets that depend on the data in here would not rebuild correctly because they wouldn't know about the change. So we have to make sure that we only change data from inside the class, because then we can trigger notify listeners, and all the other parts of the app that are listening to this class will then get rebuilt. Now, this might not be entirely clear yet because we're not listening yet, but that's the general idea here of why I do it like this. And for the moment, I'll comment this out because for the moment, we don't really know how to add products. But that's the idea why we have change notifier and why we need this setup and why I return a copy here. But with that, let's start listening. And before we can start listening, we first of all need to provide this. Thus far, we have the class, but now we need to turn this class here into a data container, into a provider which we can use in our app and in the different parts of our app. And there, the products are important in a couple of places of this app, of course. They are important in the product detail and the product's overview screen for the moment. That means that I want to provide this in the main Dart file because that's important and that's something you have to know with the provider package. You need to provide a class which you then want to use from different widgets in your app at the highest possible point of all these widgets which will be interested. Which means that if the product's overview and the product detail screen are interested in the data, I have to provide the class in a widget that is above them, which in my case is this my app widget, my root widget. If I had data which is only important to the product item widget, then I could provide that data in the product's overview widget because that is where I create the product item. No need to then manage it in the main Dart file. But here, since I have widgets which are registered on the root level, I need to also provide my data on the root level. By the way, that will not mean that the entire app will rebuild whenever something changes in the data though, but more on that in a second. So I want to provide my data here, and therefore let's import our provider, or this class we just worked on, from providers and there from the products.dart file. And now we can set up a provider here. Now, how do we register a provider in our app then? To register a provider, you need to import something from that provider package because there is a reason why we added it after all, right? So import provider Dart from the provider package. And now here in your My App widget, instead of returning material app, we'll actually wrap this into another widget. So wrap with new widget. And that new widget is now a provider. And there you got a couple of providers available. The most common provider, which I would recommend using, is the change notifier provider. And that's a class provided by that provider package which we installed. It allows us to register a class to which you can then listen in child widgets. And whenever that class updates, the widgets which are listening, and only these, not all child widgets, only child widgets which are listening, will rebuild. So here, you then have to provide a builder method. That builder method will receive a build context, and it should return a new instance of your provided class. So not a widget, a new instance of your provided class. So in our case, of the products class here. So here I simply return products like this. Now, one important note at this point though. The builder method here is the right method to choose if you are using version 3 of the provider package. So if you have, for example, this dependency in your pubspec.yaml file. If you are using the latest version, or specifically a version greater than or equal to 4, so if you, for example, have this entry in your pubspec.yaml file, then this will not work with builder. Instead, then it's create. And just like that, you simply have create instead of builder in that case. Now, I did record this course with version 3, which is why you will see builder in this video and the next videos, and you can absolutely use version 3 of the provider package. All you need to do is have this entry here in your pubspec.yaml file, for example. If you have this, you can just follow along with builder. But if you want to use the latest version, then you have to use create here. So if you have version 4 or higher, then you need create here. So don't be confused if you see something different in the next lectures. That's just because I used a different version. Now, one thing that does not change is how the provider package works, what it does, and so on. So that's all the same. Only this part here needs adjustment. Just wanted to point this out here. Now we set up a provider which provides an instance and one and the same instance of this products class to all child widgets, so material app and all its children, which are interested. So all child widgets can now set up a listener to this instance of this class, to this same instance, this same object of this class. And whenever we change something in the class and we then call notify listeners, the widgets which are listening will be rebuilt. And that's really important. Only the widgets which are listening, not the whole material app. So just because something changes in here will not rebuild material app. It will only rebuild widgets which are listening. Now, where is a place where we could be interested? Well, the products overview there. Here in the products overview, I have my grid view builder. So I need my products here. Now, actually, you could even argue to not unnecessarily rebuild the app bar, which doesn't need any products data, that we outsource this grid view builder into a separate widget. So we can grab this, use the refactoring tool, and use extract widget here, and give this a name of products grid, maybe. Now we have that new widget which is created for us. And that should actually not receive the products as an argument, but get it itself by actually using our provider. Now, first of all, I'll move my products grid here into a new file. Technically, you don't need to do that, but I rather follow that convention. So my products grid.dart file. In there, of course, you need to import your material Dart file from Flutter and also import the product model because we're referring to it here. And that's important, the product model, so our normal model in the models folder, not the products file we just worked on, but the normal model here. I also need to reference product item in here because I'm using it. So let's import product item. In the products overview screen, we now don't need that product item import anymore. I also want to grab the dummy products we have in here and move them away out of that widget into the product start file in the providers folder, because there we have these products and I want to start with some dummy products for now. So that in the products overview screen, we don't need that anymore. We don't need the product model import anymore, therefore. We just need to import that new products grid from the widgets folder. So products grid Dart. And we don't need the new keyword. So products grid is what I should import. And now products grid is created here in the products grid widget. Don't need that constructor or anything of that. I want to fetch all my data in here instead by setting up such a listener. And for that, in the build method, we can now use another feature from the provider package, and hence let's import package provider Dart here. And that other feature is provider of context. Now we've seen that of context thing a couple of times throughout the course already, with the theme, with the navigator, and so on. I already explained there that this sets up a direct communication channel behind the scenes. And this here, the provider package, allows us to set up a connection to one of the provided classes, and therefore you can only use provider of in a widget which has some direct or indirect parent widget which set up a provider, which we did here. So that needs to be set up first, that provider. But then we can listen with provider of to changes in that provided class or in that provided object, to be precise. And this build method of this widget where I'm using provider of, and only this build method, and of course all the child widgets, will rebuild whenever the object I'm listening to changes. The build method of a parent widget of products grid, like the products overview here, will not rerun because we're not setting up a listener here. And that's of course important. Not the entire widget tree does rebuild if data changes, only the widget where I'm listening, and of course then, because this build method runs, all the child widgets are rebuilt too. That's the normal behavior. The question now is, how do we set up a connection between this widget and then this specific provider? Right now we only have one provider, but actually, as you will later also see, you can have more than one provider in your app. So I want to set up a listener to my provider, which actually provides me an instance of my products class. You tell Flutter or the provider package that you're interested in an instance of that products class by taking advantage of the fact that the auth method here on the provider class provided by the provider package is a generic method, which means you can add these angle brackets to let it know to which type of data you actually want to listen to. So here I want to listen to changes in products. And now that's important. That now has to be products. So here we import from the providers folder and there from the Flutter Dart file. With this piece of information, we're telling the provider package that we want to establish a direct communication channel to the provided instance of the products class. And now the provider package goes ahead and looks at the parent of products grid, the products overview screen. And there it finds no provider. So it goes ahead and has a look at the parent of the products overview screen. And that's of course our My App widget, because that's where I'm instantiating the products overview screen. And there, if it goes up the widget tree, it indeed finds a provider. And in that provider, thankfully, it finds a provider which thankfully provides an instance of type products. If we would create a different class here, then setting up this listener, of course, would fail. But since we do provide a new products object here, we can tap into it and listen to it here with provider of products context. So this here gives us access to this products object. So I'll name this products data. And that's not our list of products, but to the object based on this class. And this will then have a items getter because we added it here. So the products we actually work with are then simply fetched from products data by accessing items like this. And this now gives us a list of products. And since type inference works here, we actually don't need the product model import because we don't need the product class itself here in the products grid. With that, we now get our products here. And we can now use the products here to determine the length and then forward that data to the product item. In the product item, as I explained earlier in this module, I'm fine with getting this data as an argument because this is data which this widget itself needs, which we don't just get to forward it, but which we want to output in that widget. And therefore, it's fine to accept it like this. It's actually recommended to get it like this because then it's very clear to see which configuration this widget needs to work correctly. And you can drop this widget anywhere into your app where you know you get this data, no matter if you have a provider above it or not. So with that was a lot of talking, but very important. Let's do a full restart now. And in our app, we now still see our items here, but now we're actually loading them with the help of our provided class. And the advantage, if not already evident, will become more and more clear the more complex our application gets. In the last lecture, I introduced mix-ins, and it's important to understand what mix-ins really are and what the difference to classes or to extending a class is. So here I'm back in Dartpad, but of course the same code could be run in a Flutter app. Let's start simple. Let's create a new class, a person class. And that's what we did before in Dartpad, and we created classes all the time here in this course thus far. I'll keep this simple. It'll have a name property and an age property. Then we might have a constructor which allows us to assign values to the name and the age properties. Now, it's of course no surprise that we can create a new person here with the help of that person constructor by passing values for these arguments. And then here, if we print pers.name and we run this code, and I also fixed this error of having a colon here where we should have a semicolon, we get max here. So that's nothing too new. That's a class. Now you also learned that classes can extend other things. So for example, we could have a class mammal, which in the end has a method, let's say, which doesn't return anything, which is named breathe. And there we just print breathe in, breathe out, something like that. Now, unsurprisingly, this person can extend mammal. That's also what you learned. Extending classes, a concept called inheritance. That's a core thing of object-oriented programming languages, and therefore Dart has this too. The consequence of person extending mammal is that on the person here, we can now also call breathe. And in addition to that, pers, so this variable now has two types. It is of type person, but it's also of type mammal. So if we had some other place in this application that wants an argument which is of type mammal, we could pass in pers as well, because since it's of type person, which extends mammal, it's automatically also of type mammal. So let's run this code here. And of course, we see breathe in, breathe out. So that's working because of inheritance. Now, the core idea behind inheritance is that this class, the person class, gets all the properties and methods of the mammal class. You can also override methods there with add override, and then by simply, well, defining the same method here, whoops, breathe, like this, that would be possible. And you got the same type. Now, another important thing you have to understand when using extends and inheritance is that you really are also saying that there should be a strong connection between this class and this class from a logical point of view. So technically, you're just getting all the properties and all the methods, but logically, there also should be a strong connection. So you inherit if you would say that in real life, there would be a connection as well. Now let's have a look at a mix-in. You create a mix-in with the mix-in keyword, and thus far we haven't created one manually, we're just using one provided by Flutter, but here we can create one, and we could name this agility or anything like that. Now let's say there we have a method sit down, where we just print sitting down. Now in a mix-in we could also have properties, it's like a class when it comes to that, so we could also have a speed property of 10. And we can now use such a mix-in on this class here with the with keyword. There we can use agility, and with that we can, for example, print person speed, because the mix-in has a speed property, and by adding a mix-in to a class, you get all the properties and methods of that mix-in in your class. So person now has the speed property, and it also is able to call sit down. So if I run this, we see 10, that's the speed, and sitting down. So what's the difference between using extends and with then, other than that we use mix-in here? The idea behind a mix-in is that you can share methods and properties with multiple classes, but logically, you have less of a strong connection. A person extends mammal because a person is a mammal. Logically, in real life, you have a strong connection here. Agility is something which could provide utility methods for moving something, for sitting, for doing all kinds of things which are considered agile. We could add that to anything. We could add it to a person, we could add it to a dog, we could add that to objects, we could add that to boxes or to containers if we're building an application that has such things. So anything that can move could have agility, but mammal would really only belong to a person. So the logical relation between that is much stronger than between person and agility. Agility is more like a utility function provider, which we can use to mix certain features into this class. And that's essentially also what we did in the previous lecture. There we added with change notifier to add the utility methods. This gives us the notify listeners method mainly to an existing class. Other than that, there is no strong relation. We just want that utility method in the end. Another important difference is that with inheritance, you can always only inherit from one object, from one class. So person can extend mammal, but we would not be able to extend both mammal and another class. That does not work. Some programming languages support multiple parents. Dart is not one of them. You can only have one parent class. With mixins, however, you can add as many mixins as you want. So you can add multiple mixins to the same class, and all their properties and methods will be merged together in the class. So really think of mixins as utility functionality providers, whereas when you use inheritance, you really have a strong logical dependency between the two classes. To take advantage of our products provider, let's for example go to the product detail widget, to the product detail screen, where we also need product data. And there I get the product ID. Now, thanks to us providing our products up here, our products object, we can, since product detail screen is of course also a child of the change notifier provider here, we can tap into our provider data here as well. So here where I get my product ID, I can also use provider auth, now use the angle brackets to be clear that I'm interested in an instance of the products class. And therefore, let's of course add an import here at the top. Import from providers, product start, and then forward the context, which is our communication channel, so to say. To use provider, I also need to import the provider package. So let's import package provider Dart. And with that provider import added, now here we actually can get access to our products data as well. And we can now find a product with that ID there. We can simply chain another method, because this here gives us access to the whole products object. We know we get items there. And on the items, if I want to find one with a specific ID, I can get the first where a specific condition is met. That condition is expressed as a function where we get every item, so every product in our case here. And then I want to return true if that ID of the product I'm looking at is equal to the product ID I got here through my route. With that, I know which product was loaded. So here I have my loaded product in the end, and now I can use that loaded product title here to output that title. And hence, now if I tap on a product here, we see the right title in the app bar. So this is how easy you can now use your centrally managed data and tap into it. Now actually here, however, we can improve two things. One of the things is that we want to move as much logic as possible out of our widgets into, for example, our provider class here. So this filtering for ID here would be better done inside of that class, where we can of course simply add a new method. We can add a method which returns a product in the end, which I'll name find by ID. And in there, I want to get an ID as an input, as an argument, but then I return underscore items first where, with my logic which I just defined before, where I compare the ID of each product to the ID I'm getting as an argument. So therefore this will return an item which it identified, and the heavy lifting, the core logic, is hidden away here in my provider class, and my widget can therefore stay pretty lean. Here on the products object I'm getting from my provider, I can simply call find by ID, forward that product ID, and we're done. And now this is a bit leaner here, and which is something you generally want to have. You want to have lean widgets and have your logic somewhere else in the app, like here in the provider class. Now in the product detail screen, there is another thing we can improve, and that is here. With that provider auth thing, I mentioned that I set up a listener which reruns this build method whenever products change. Now you could argue that here on the product detail screen, there's little that could change about products which needs this widget to rebuild. Maybe we added a new product somewhere else in the app. Well, that shouldn't impact this screen if it's still somehow visible and can be seen by the user. So I don't really want to rebuild this widget when my data changes here. Instead, I just want to tap into my data here one time when this screen is built for the first time and never really update whenever something changes. And for that, this auth method here on provider gives you a special argument, the listen argument, which you can set to false. Now, the default is true, and if it is set to true, which you don't need to do because, well, it's the default, then the build method of the widget in which you're using provider of will rerun whenever the provided object, so in this case the product object, changed. The object we're providing here. So if this would change, or the data in there would change, so if we call notify listeners in there, then all widgets that use provider of would rebuild. With listen false, this widget here will not rebuild if notify listeners is called because it's not set up as an active listener. And that, of course, is something you should do. If you only need data one time, you just want to get data from your global data storage, but you're not interested in updates, then you don't need to listen. Of course, it's a different thing here in the products grid. There, I want to rebuild my grid when I have a new product or when my products change in some way. So here, I definitely don't want to set listen to false, but I want to listen to changes. With this, we started working with the providers package, and we're using our providers package at least a little bit already. Thus far, however, only for getting some dummy data, of course. Let's next manage the favorite status of products, because that's something where the provider package can help us as well. So we added one provider, our products provider, which we use in the products grid in the end. We use it there because we're setting up a subscription, and that subscription, or that listener here with provider of, works because we're providing our products object, which manages our list of products here with change notifier provider. Now I want to make sure that we can mark products as favorites. Now, if we have a look at the product model, which is not yet usable by a provider because we're not implementing with change notifier, which means we couldn't trigger our listeners from inside it. This model has the favorite boolean here, and it's also not a final boolean, so we could change that. Now, I think it would be pretty neat if the products we had here in our providers package, which do use this product model, could use that product model such that if we change the favorite status of a product, we automatically notify all places in the app that require a single product and are interested. You always have to specify that you are interested with the help of provider of, so that the widgets that depend on a single product and are interested are rebuilt whenever that single product changes, which in our case here means whenever the isFavorite status changes, because that's the only thing which can change. Now, therefore, I'll move product here over into providers. Alternatively, we could now both rename to models if we wanted to, so rename that folder to models. But I'll simply move the product Dart file over into providers and add with change notifier here as well, which is available also thanks to the foundation Dart import. So you can use either the foundation Dart import or the material Dart import. Now here in the products Dart file, I'm referring to that product, so to that single product Dart file, and it's now in the same folder, so the import path should change to /product Dart. With that, I'm still treating products here, but these products now actually can notify listeners when they changed. Now, what would be a place where I'm interested in a changing product? Now, you might think that would be the product detail page, but that's actually not the case. There, I load a single product based on the ID, which I got, and thereafter, I don't really care whether that changes or not. I'm not displaying the favorite status on this screen, and I also can't change it from on this screen. Well, right now this screen is pretty empty, to be honest. We'll add more, but we'll not add anything that would allow us to change the favorite status on the screen. So the product details screen here is not really a place where I want to reactively listen to changes in a single product. The product item Dart file is a different file. There, the product item widget, which is that grid tile we're creating, there I do have this button which represents the favorite status of a product here. And I actually want to switch that icon based on whether this product already is a favorite or not. So therefore here, of course, I need product data, and I need specific data about whether this product now is a favorite or not. So I'm interested in hearing about changes in that product. What does this mean for us? It means that here I want to set up a listener to a single product, and that's now important, to a single product, not to all products, but to my single product here. In that product class, we also need a way of manipulating this Boolean here in a way that also allows us to call notify listeners. And of course, what else is missing? We have a listener, we have a class. We need to set up a provider. What we're doing in main Dart here for products, we also need to do that for all our single products. Now let's start by setting up a provider. In the products grid widget, I'm listening to all my products. And then for every product we have, we're creating a product item here in the end, a tile in our grid. So in the end, it's here where I need to provide my product object based on the product class. Now in the main Dart file, we're doing that here right at the top so that the entire app can in the end listen to changes in products, because we need products in different places. Now my single product here is actually really only needed in every product item list tile. So therefore here where I get all my products, I want to set up a new provider here above my product item so that inside of the product item we can then listen to changes in that product. And since this builder here runs for every product in our products list, that's perfect, because then we can set up different providers for our different product objects. Because for products, we really only have one object for the entire app, defined here in main Dart. For the single product, so for the individual product items, that's a bit different. We have multiple products there, multiple product items, so we can't set up a single provider. We need multiple providers, one for each product. Now, we're not setting up the provider here inside of the products class because that won't really work. Instead, we have to do that in our widget tree, but that's no problem. Because here we have access to all our products, to the product items stored in the products class. And therefore here we can set up a new change notifier provider, just as we did it in the main Dart file. This is what I'm now returning in my item builder. This takes a child, and the child still is the product item here in the end, so we can still keep that code. But now I also want to set up a builder where I build my product object. Now the thing, of course, here is I already have my product objects, right? They're built here. Here I instantiate my product objects. I do this inside of the products class. So I don't want to reinstantiate product objects now. I don't want to build a new product object. But that's no problem. In our builder here, where I get a new context passed in automatically, where I simply have to return the value which I want to provide, I can simply return products I. This will return a single product item as it's stored in the products class, and it will do this multiple times because it's inside of the item builder for all the products I have. Now, since I'm providing a single product here, that also means we could, but we don't have to, receive our product data as arguments here in product item. Instead, here I'm not passing anything, because inside of product item, we could now get rid of all of that, and it wouldn't have been a problem to receive this before. But now, since I'm interested in some dynamic value in a single product, it makes sense to use a provider here. So now in here, I can again use provider of, and for that, of course, you need to import the provider package here in the product item Dart file. So provider of, and now of product, because I'm interested in a single product. So let's import that provider now from the providers folder, there from the product Dart file, not products, but product. And it will now look for the nearest product which is provided, which simply happens here in the products grid, where I'm providing a product for this product's item. And a new product, a different product, is provided for every different product item which is rendered, so for every grid tile, because we're repeating this code for all the products. So this reruns for all the products we have, and hence we provide a brand new product for every product item, which of course is exactly what we want. We want to provide the correct product item or the correct product element for every product item widget. Now there is actually one little problem you should be aware of when working with nested providers as we're doing it here. When you're using it in a list or in a grid, as we're doing it here, where Flutter removes items when they leave the screen and re-adds them when they re-enter the screen, in such situations, what actually happens is that the widget itself is reused by Flutter and just the data that's attached to it changes. So Flutter recycles the same widget. It doesn't destroy it and recreate it, which would work fine with our nested provider, but it recycles it, which means that we're actually attaching a provider to a widget here, which content changes over time and our provider won't pick this up. Therefore, the more items you have in your list, as soon as you have items that are not visible all the time, you will run into strange errors and bugs. But we'll fix this in the next lecture. This is a good first step, and this is an approach you can always use if you're not using a list or a grid. So in product item, I can now listen to that, pass in my context, of course, which is this important communication channel. And in here, I get my product or whatever you want to name it. So I have my product variable here, which won't change in this build run here, hence it's final. And then I can use product ID here to forward that. I can use product image URL here, and I can use product title down there. If we save that, you see this still renders as before, but now we're actually using a different pattern. The question, of course, is why are we using that pattern? Because I now, of course, want to make sure that when we tap that favorite button, we switch the favorite status of a single product. For that, in our product provider file up there in the providers folder, let's add a new method, which doesn't return anything, which I'll name toggle favorite status. And you can name this whatever you want. The idea here simply is that we invert the value of isFavorite. So if it's currently true, I want to set it to false. If it's set to false, I want to set it to true. So here I'll set isFavorite equal to not isFavorite. And the exclamation mark here simply inverts the value. So if it is true, then this here will return false, and therefore the new value will be false. If it was false, then this here will return true, and the new value is true. Now, again, to let all listeners know, we need to call notify listeners. So you could kind of say that's like set state in the provider package. You let listening widgets know that something changed and they should rebuild. It's the equivalent to set state in stateful widgets, which we now don't really need here when we're managing something with the provider package. Though you don't have to manage everything with the provider package, but I'll come back to this later. So we're notifying our listeners that this model changed, that we changed something in this object. We changed the favorite status. We can now use that favorite status in the product item. For one here, when we press this button, of course, I want to use my product, which I'm getting here with my listener, and call toggle favorite status, because that's one thing that should always happen. And I want to reflect the current favorite status here with the icon. So we can simply check product is favorite, and if it is true, then I want to show that favorite icon, which is that filled out heart, and otherwise I'll show favorite border, which is that heart where we got no filling. If we now save this and maybe do a full refresh here to make sure that this really gets used, you now see we have empty hearts everywhere, but if I tap it, it gets filled out, and again, then also toggle it off. And that's correctly reflected on my different items. And this happens and this works thanks to the provider pattern, where we are informed about changes here in product when we tap a heart. By the way, that's a nice use case or a nice place to show what happens if I set listen to false here. Now, for every product item that gets rendered in our grid, we only fetch the product data, but then we don't set up an ongoing listener. That means that when isFavorite changes here, it will still change behind the scenes, but notify listeners will not reach this build method in this widget because we opted out of updates. We're not listening. So this product here will not receive this updated isFavorite status, therefore build will not rerun, and therefore will not see the new icon. So if we now do a full hot refresh here, you see I can tap these icons as long as I want. Nothing changes there because we're not listening to updates. Of course, here that's not what we want, so I'll remove that, but it's important to understand what listen false does. So now with this changed, you see now this updates again. Time for some alternative syntaxes. There's nothing wrong with the way we provided our packages or our data thus far, but I'm always a fan of showing you alternative ways of doing something. For example, here in the main Dart file, we're having our change notifier provider where we need to provide that builder method, and this then actually runs this function, gets a context, returns the data we want to provide. If that data does not depend on the context, as we do here, it's kind of redundant to get that. Of course, you can then use an underscore to signal that you're not interested in it. But actually, there also is then a shortcut or an alternative constructor for a change notifier provider, which you could use, and that is the .value constructor. Instead of a builder, this simply takes a value argument, and that is the value you want to provide. And if your value doesn't depend on the context, you can absolutely use this instead of the builder method. And of course, it's the same in here in products grid, where I have the change notifier provider with the builder function. You can use that, but you can also use the value constructor of change notifier provider and simply provide a value, which in our case here is that single product. And if you do that and you do a full refresh here, of course, you see it still works as before, but now it's a bit shorter. So that's option number one, which makes sense if you're not really using the context. Now, there actually is an important difference between change notifier provider .value and the approach we had before with the builder function. This .value approach here is the right approach you should use if you, for example, use a provider on something that's part of a list or of a grid. Because of the issue I described in the last lecture where widgets are recycled by Flutter, but the data that's attached to the widget changes. When using change notifier provider.value, you actually make sure that the provider works even if data changes for the widget. If you had a builder function, that would not work correctly. Here, it will work correctly because now the provider is tied to its data and is attached and detached to and from the widget instead of changing data being attached to the same provider. So this .value constructor syntax is the approach you should use in this scenario here and in all scenarios where you have the provider package and you're providing your data on single list or grid items where Flutter then actually will recycle the widgets you're attaching your provider to. With this .value constructor approach, that will work without issues. With the builder function we used before, that would cause bugs as soon as you have more items that do actually go beyond the screen boundaries because of the way widgets are recycled and your data changes and your provider wouldn't keep up with that. The .value constructor will keep up with that. That's just a little side note. Now, one other important note about change notifier provider, also with the .value approach here, in main Dart, where I'm also using this, here, there it's actually the better approach to not use this way of providing this product's value, but instead here, you should use that old approach of having the create or the builder method, where you then get your context and create products like this. Why? Because whenever you instantiate a class, so whenever you create a new object based on a class, as we're doing it here, if you do that to provide that object to the change notifier provider, you should use the create method for efficiency and to avoid bugs. Whenever you reuse an existing object, like we're doing it in the grid, where we cycle through a list of products which already all exist, it's recommended that you use that value approach, so with the .value constructor. Now, it would also work if we would use the .value constructor here in main Dart. It just might be a little bit less efficient and maybe lead to unnecessary re-renders, or in some apps it might be buggy. Therefore, when you create a new instance of an object and you want to provide this, use the create or the builder method, as I'm doing it here in main Dart now. If you reuse an existing object, like we're doing it in the products grid, you should use the .value provider with the value you're providing, as we're doing it here. Now, over the next lectures, you actually see that I, in the main Dart file, still use the .value provider, so the one I told you is not the best possible way of doing it, because it won't hurt this application. Just because it's not the best possible way does not mean that it doesn't work, that it crashes your app, or that it's super inefficient. I just want to tell you this best practice which emerged since I recorded the course, so that you're aware of it. You could also use the other approach, which I'm going to use over the next lectures, but using create, if you are creating a new instance, is recommended. There's another important thing. If we navigate to a totally different screen, and with that I don't mean the detail screen, which is pushed on top of the grid screen, but if we had tabs or if we used push replacement and we had a screen that replaces the old screen, then it's important that we clean up our provided data. Flutter automatically for you cleans up all the widgets it built so that they don't take up space in memory anymore. But your provided data would still end up in memory, and that would be bad, because the more often you then visit and leave that page, the more data is stored in memory, and that leads to memory leaks, where your memory will at some point overflow. So it's important that you dispose of the data you're storing here. And here the good thing is, change notifier provider, no matter if you use it with the value constructor or not, automatically cleans up that data for you when it's not required anymore. So you don't have to worry about that. It's just important to be aware of that, because maybe you didn't think about that. And actually, that would be pretty normal at this point that you don't think about this. But if you ever come to that point and you think, well, what's happening to my old data? No worries, change notifier provider cleans it up for you. There's another alternative syntax which I want to show you that's related to how you listen to changes. Thus far, we always use provider off, and to be honest, that's the most common way of doing it. But there's another way which is totally equal, which you could also use. You could also wrap the parts of your widget tree that are interested in an update into a new widget. And that widget would be the consumer widget. Now, for a consumer to be available, you need to import your provider package, because that is provided by the provider package. And consumer then actually does not take just a child, but actually a builder, and you have to provide a builder. Now that builder takes a context, then something dynamic, and then a widget. Now what's that? Now first of all, you have to know that consumer is a generic type, and of course you should provide or mention which type of data you want to consume. And then this is pretty equal to provider of. So this establishes the connection to your provided data, and it looks for the nearest provider of that type up in the widget tree. This builder then receives a context. It receives an instance, or the nearest instance it found of that data. So our product here. And then it receives a child. Now, let's worry about the child a second. Let's first of all focus on what it should return. And there, it should of course return what you returned before. So here I'll cut all of that, get rid of this child here for the moment, and simply return in the builder this widget tree, which depends on our provided data. So now we can comment out this provider of thing up there, and we're setting up a listener here with consumer. If you do a full refresh now, you see I can still click these hearts and have the same behavior as before. Now, why would we use this approach then? Well, generally it's exactly the same, so it's up to you. But it can have a couple of advantages depending on how you use it. When you use provider off, then the whole build method will rerun whenever that data changes. Now with clever widget splitting, you can split your widgets such that this isn't a problem because you want to run the entire build method when something changes. But you could also have a case where you only want to run a subpart of your widgets tree when some data changes. And then you could only wrap the subpart of the widget tree that depends on your product data with that listener. That would be an option. And even here, for example, you could get your product here with listen false to get all that one-time data which you don't expect to change, like the title or the image URL. And you could then use consumer, not up here, but down there around your favorite button to wrap only that with that consumer, because that's the only place in this widget which really does change when our product changes. So just to demonstrate this, we could get our product here with listen false, and then we use consumer product here, cut this, and here still return clip rect, and only wrap our leading icon button here with this consumer. Now, of course, make sure you manage your parentheses correctly, remove one at the end, and wrap the icon button in one more. And now what I achieved here is I have that general product, which I'm extracting from my provided product, but I don't listen to updates there. I need that general product because I'm getting the ID from there, the image URL, and the title. But then I have this part of my widget tree down there, which actually also listens to my nearest product, but here I am interested in changes, and consumer always listens to changes here. And I then rebuild the icon button whenever my product changes. So I shrink the area of the widget which reruns when my product changes. And to prove that, let me throw a little print statement in here. Product rebuilds. And we should see that this now doesn't run when my heart here is clicked. So it runs initially here. And now if I clear that and I press the heart, you see it doesn't run. And that would change if I don't set this here to false, of course. If I, just to prove this, do this real quick. Now if I press the heart, you of course see product rebuilds there as well. So that's a tiny improvement we can actually implement here, because consumer allows us to, since it's a widget, throw it somewhere into our widget tree and then only rebuild the nested children. Since this here is not a widget, but simply a method or a way of extracting data and storing it in a variable, it always triggers the whole build method. Again, you could achieve something similar to having a consumer down there by splitting your widgets in an efficient way. For example, we could have outsourced the icon button here into a separate widget, then used provider off in there with listen to true, or not defined at all since true is the default, and we would have a similar setup. But this here is another way where you can easily control a part of your widget tree and make it a listener, whereas the majority of the tree is not a listener. Now, what's up with that child you're getting here as a third argument? If you have parts in your widget tree, which then does update, which you don't actually want to rebuild when it generally rebuilds this, then on the consumer, as an argument, you can pass in a child, and that could be some data like a text widget, which never changes, which doesn't depend on the data you're generally listening to. And this child you're defining here, which can also be a more complex widget tree or a custom widget, of course, is then ending up here in this child argument, which is passed into this builder function, and you can then reference it in there. Now here, I don't need it because all my parts here in the end are dynamic. But if you had something else here, like a label, which the icon button doesn't have, but if it would have a label, and that should be your text widget there, which shouldn't rebuild just because product changed, then you could refer to your child argument here, and this child argument up there would refer to the value you stored here, and it wouldn't rebuild when your consumer generally does rebuild its builder widget here, or its builder function. So it can be a tiny optimization if in this part, which generally should update, you still have parts that shouldn't update. It's a bit more advanced, we don't need it here, hence I'll add a underscore. The core takeaway here really is that consumer can be used to only rebuild parts of the widget tree instead of the entire widget tree. Again, something you could have also achieved with clever widget splitting and only provider off. But it's up to you what you use, and there generally is no better or worse option. So we had a look at the essentials of the provider package. And actually, it's not just the essentials, it's pretty much all you have to know. Provider off or consumer, to set up a listener to a provider, which you typically provide with change notifier provider somewhere up in the widget tree. Either as we do it here on the root level, or as we do it in the products grid, right above the widget where we need it. Doesn't matter. In general, you want to set up that provider on as low as a level as possible. So not necessarily up at the root level of your app, but of course, if you need it in the entire app, provide it here. So this is the provider, and you also learn about how to listen to changes and that you have some optimization potential with listen false, and maybe also by using a consumer if only parts of your widget tree depend on it. A valid question now, of course, is why do we not use a stateful widget here? We're now using the provider to manage whether our product is a favorite or not. But we only need that information here to change the icon which I'm displaying. Now, since I changed that icon here in my product item widget, we could, of course, also turn this into a stateful widget, have a is favorite or show favorite property in here, since this is a single item in our grid, and then simply change that property when we click this button here. And yes, this would be absolutely the right thing to do if you have some state, some data, which only affects this widget. Remember that slide, the bottom right area here? Widget local state. That's state which only affects a single widget. And if you only want to switch the icon on a button in a widget, then of course you would typically manage that state only in that widget, and therefore you would always use a stateful widget. Don't use provider or a provided class if you only want to change how something is displayed inside of a widget. Here I'm using the provider package, not because I want to use providers everywhere, but because the data, the information, whether this product is a favorite or not, does not only matter to this widget. Right now in our app it does, but that will now change. In the products overview screen, there, I now also want to add an icon or an option here in the app bar that allows us to switch between favorite and all products, so that we can actually take that favorite information and filter our grid here based on it. And that of course means that the information about whether a product is a favorite or not does not just matter to the product item, but to the entire app, or at least to a significant part of that app. So let's now start implementing that. For this here in the app bar, I want to add actions, or for the moment, one action. And there I'll add a widget, which we haven't seen before, a pop menu button. That's a button which will basically open a kind of a drop over menu, a menu which opens up as an overlay. Now we give this a button which should be displayed in our app bar, and that should be an icon widget, and there I'll use the more vert icon, which are 3 dots aligned or positioned above each other vertically. The pop-up menu button then also needs an item builder, which builds the entries for this pop-up menu. There you get the context, which I don't need here, so I'll add an underscore. And then you return a list of widgets, not a single widget, but a list of widgets, which will be added as entries in this pop-up menu. And here you should use pop-up menu items. Now each menu item here has a child, and that typically is some text, but could also be a row with an icon next to a text, for example. And here I'll say only favorites. And besides that child, you also provide a value, which is later important for finding out which choice was, or which item was chosen by the user. So I'll give this a 0. You can use any identifier you want, could also be a string. And I'll then copy this and create another pop-up menu item where I say show all, and there the value could be 1. Now on the pop-up menu button, you also add on selected function here, an anonymous function or a named function, it's up to you, where you will get the selected value. Now we know that we'll get an integer here, so we can add int here in front of that to make it really clear to Dart that selected value will be an integer. It will be this value, depending on which option the user chose. And for now, let's simply print the selected value to see whether that works. Now to see it in action, let's save that. And now you should see 3 dots here. And if you tap them, this pop-up opens up and you can choose only favorites or show all. And therefore here you see the 2 print statements for the values we chose. Now, first of all, such a scenario here is always a good place for an enum. Of course, we can use 0 and 1, but to have a really easy way of working with that, we can define an enum. Since we really only need it here, we can define it here in the same file. And I'll name it filter options, but the name is totally up to you. And there are 2 values I want to have, favorites and all. So these are the 2 values. And as you learned, enums are really just ways of assigning labels to integers, so that behind the scenes we still have integers, but we as a developer can work with these labels. So therefore down there, for this value, I'll have my filter options favorites, and here I'll have my filter options all. Doesn't change the way this works, besides one thing, this here will now be of type filter options. Now, the idea, of course, is to filter the items we're displaying based on the filter we chose here. And the most efficient way of doing this is to simply change the products we have here in our products class. Because we're consuming these products in the products grid in the end, we're setting up a listener to products here. So if the products change, this will rebuild. And it should, of course, rebuild when the products change, because we will change the products when the user selects to filter them. And that should affect our grid. So in the products overview here, we want to find out which option was chosen. So if selected value here is equal to filter options favorites, let's say. And in that case, we want to do something that reduces the amount of items we're showing, and else we're showing all items. So now in the product start file, in our provider class, I want to change this items list based on, well, whether we set a filter or not. Now, one way of managing this is to add a new property in this products class here. Show favorites only, which initially is false. And then here, where we get all the items, we take this into account to determine which items to return. So here we could now check if show favorites only. And if that is true, then I want to return my items where, for my item which I'm looking at, is favorite is true, and then we convert this to a list. It's a new list automatically, so we don't need to do that manual copying. We're down there. If we don't make it into there, we return all items. Now this is one approach we can take. And now if we go to the products overview, here all we have to do is we have to access our products provider. So we get our products data or products container, whatever you want to name it, with provider, for which you have to import the provider package of. Now I'm interested in products, so we need to import that class as well from the providers folder, and they are from Flutter Dart, and forward the context. And whoops, that should therefore be done in the build method, of course. And now with products container down there, we can say if we're in here, then I want to call some method which switches show favorites only, which actually should be private. So let's add an underscore, but then let's add a new method which you could name show favorites only. And then there we could set show favorites only to true. And then we have show all, and there we set show favorites only to false because we want to show all. And back in the products overview screen, first of all, I want to set up listen false here because I'm not really interested in the data or whether it changes. I only need to get access to that container so that I can call these two new methods we added. Because then here, if we are filtering for favorites, I can call show favorites only. And here I can call show all, like this. If we do that and we do a full restart, I can now actually filter for only the favorites or for all, but it doesn't make a difference. Reason for that is that in the products class, of course, we also have to call notify listeners to rebuild the parts that are interested in our products data here. So do it both for show favorites only and show all. And with notify listeners added there, now if I select only favorites, I see nothing. If I select show all, we see all. Looks good, but has a flaw. We could implement it like this. And I did it like this to also now show you what the problem would be. If we had another part of this app, which we don't have yet, but if we had another screen which also shows our products, then when we choose a filter here on the products overview screen and we then go to that other screen, our filter would still be applied there because our getter only returns data based on what we set here as a filter. And that's what we control from that other screen. Now, if you want to have an application-wide filter, this is your approach. But often, you only want to filter on this screen, and if you then go to some other screen, you don't want to apply that same filter. Let's say you have a screen where you manage your products and another screen where you view all products. If you filter on the all products screen, you probably don't want to filter on your these are all my products screen as well. So therefore, managing something like this filtering here in our provided class can often be a problem because it's really information that belongs to a single widget and not into the global app-wide state. So with that, we're back to this slide. We're more on the right side here with that filtering than on the left side. This actually is not the approach I want to use. I always want to return all my items here. And I don't really want to have these methods here which control what is displayed or not. I don't want to manage what is displayed in my provided class here, but inside of my widgets. And therefore here in the product overview screen, I don't really want to use my provided products data and switch my display state or my filter options there. Instead, the better option here indeed would be to turn this into a state full widget. The products overview screen is now a state full widget. And there in the state object, we can now manage this show only favorites data, which is a boolean initially set to false. And I want to switch that when we actually select the value in the pop-up menu. So if we did go for favorites, then I want to set show only favorites to true. And otherwise, I want to set it to false. Now, what do we do with that information here? Well, we can now pass that down to the products grid because that actually is the widget which displays our products. So there we can forward show only favorites. And now in the products grid, we only need to expect this. So here I have a final boolean show favs or whatever you want to name it. And of course, we now have to add our constructor to accept this show favs argument and store it in this property. And now here we can use show favs. We're fetching the items, but now I want to show only the favorites. And now to not have all the logic of filtering in here, we can still go to the products class and simply add another getter in there. A getter which still returns a list of products, of single product items, which I'll name favorite items, because here I will return my filtering logic where I access all items, then use where, and for every prod item I return true if is favorite is true, and then I convert this to a new list. So now we simply have an alternative getter, favorite items, which does that filtering logic, and I reach out to that getter in my products grid if show favs is true. So instead of using items here, I simply can check show favs. And if that is true, then I don't use product data.items, but I simply use product products data.favorite items, and otherwise I use items in general. So now we have a setup where we should still have a grid that changes, but we're managing the important logic in our widgets now. Now, one important fine-tuning is, of course, in the product's overview screen, you should wrap this part where you change show only favorites with set state so that the UI is rebuilt when you change it. So let's move this entire if block here into this. This is important because otherwise you could change the data, but it would not be reflected on the UI. And now with that, if we go back, we can choose our filtering logic here. And as you see, if I mark something as a favorite, this also does work. But now we're managing this in our widget because it really only affects this widget, the product's overview widget and its children, like the product grid here, of course, most importantly. So now we can mark items as favorites and we can filter for that, which is pretty neat. What else can we do in this app? Well, quite a lot. How about adding items to a cart? That's something we can't do right now. This button here doesn't do anything. So this is the next step or the next thing I want to focus on. I want to be able to click that add to cart item here in a product item and then actually, well, add that item to a cart. For this, the first question, of course, is how do we want to manage our cart? We could manage it here in our products provider in this class. But I rather want to manage my products in here. And later, for example, we'll also have ways of adding and editing and deleting products. And I want to manage all of that in here, but not really the cart. Hence, it makes sense to add a new class. And I'll add it in a new file, the cart.dart file. In there, cart is the class. And since I plan on using this with the provider package and I want to notify widgets that are listening about updates, we'll add the change notifier mix in here, which you can also import from Widgets Dart. So from Foundation, Material, or Widgets Dart, that all works. Simply because all these files also inherit or import from each other, you could say. So now here, that's my cart. And in that cart, I want to have a couple of cart items. I'll define it here next to my cart class, but you could define it in a separate file too. And I'll name this cart item. This is now just a class, not using change notifier. And then here I simply want to define how a cart item should look like in this application. Now, as always, there are various ways of structuring this. I think every item should have an ID. It should probably have a title of the product which is stored in the cart. It should also have a quantity, so how many of these items, of these products do we have in there? Is it 1 t-shirt or 5? And also the price per product. And we can then calculate the total price, of course, by multiplying it with the quantity. We need a constructor here for a cart item. And again, as always, you can use named or unnamed positional arguments. I'll go for named ones here. Get the ID, get the title, get the quantity, and get the price. And also, as always, I actually will add required here because we need all that information. Like this. Now the cart items can be managed here in the cart class. So in here, we could have a list of cart items, but actually, I want to map every cart item to the ID of the product it belongs to. This ID here in the cart item should be the ID of this, well, cart item. That's not the same as the ID of the product, because every cart item is not just a product, it is a new object which also contains information about the quantity, for example. So this cart item object has a different ID than the product it belongs to. So here I want to manage my cart items that I have in a cart in a map where the key is the product ID. This will also make it very simple for us to work with this card later. So we can have a map where the keys are strings, because product IDs in our product model are just strings. And the value will be, well, of type card item. And then we have our items, or underscore items here to be precise. And initially, that's nothing. Whoops, and that is card item with a capital I. But now, of course, we want to be able to get our items that are in the card. So I can add a getter where we get that same map. I'll name this items, and there I return a new map, and we can also use the spread operator here on items to pull out the key value pairs from this items map and add it to a new map to return a copy. And add the get keyword in front of that. But besides a getter, I now also want to have a way of adding an item. So here I'll add a function, add item, where I expect to get some information about the product, namely the product ID, the price, and the title. And quantity will always be 1. We can only add one item at a time, let's say. So these are the 3 pieces of information which I need here: title, price, and then the ID, which I use as a key in the map. And now the goal, of course, is to add that item to our card items. For that, we first of all need to check whether we already have that item in the card, because if we do, we only need to increase the quantity. If we don't have it in there yet, we need to add a brand new entry to our card items map. So here I'll add a if check and check my underscore items, which are the items in the card, with contains key whether they already have an entry for this product ID. And that's the advantage of using the product ID as a key. We can conveniently check whether we have an entry for that ID, and if yes, we know we already have a card item for that product in there. We need to simply change the quantity. So here product ID is the key for which I check. And then in here, we need to change the quantity of that existing entry. Else, we need to add a new entry. And let's start with that else case. There, I of course want to access my items and then use put if absent to add a new entry to that map, where the key is the product ID, of course. And then the value which I want to add is my card item, a new card item which I instantiate here. Now that card item needs to get an ID, and here I'll use datetime now to string to have a kind of unique ID, not perfect, but will do for now. We then need to forward the title, which we get as an argument, of course, here. And we also need to forward the price, which we also get as an argument. Now important, put if absent actually does not just take a value here, but a function that creates the value. So we can simply add an anonymous function here which returns that new card item. And price here, of course, should be a double. That's also important. So with that, we're creating a new card item here. And now we need to set the quantity. And of course, the quantity here is simply 1. We added it for the first time. So this adds a new card item to our map of card items. Now, what if we already contain that key? If we already have an entry for that card item, then we just want to change the quantity. And that means we can simply call items update. And now we define the key for which we want to update the value, and that's product ID. And then here update also takes a function which should return the new card item we want to store. So here we have a new card item instance, and this function automatically gets the existing card item, so the existing value it found for this key, which is of course great, because that means we can update the new item based on the old item. So that's something we get automatically from the update method. It calls this function here and automatically gives us the existing item. So here this new card item which we built will therefore be based on the existing card item, and it will, for example, keep the ID of the existing card item. It will keep what we stored as a title there, and it will keep what we stored as a price there. That doesn't change, but the quantity should change, and that's our existing card item quantity plus 1. So we add 1 to the quantity. That's the core difference. So with that, we're updating our map of items. We're updating our map of card items. Now we can start using that card in our application. To start using that cart here. Let's first of all think about where we need it. Later we'll need it in the products overview screen, because there in the app bar, next to the pop-up menu button here in the app bar, I want to add a cart icon which is displayed up there, which we can click or tap to go to the cart screen where we see all the cart entries. And on that cart icon, I also want to show a label that shows us how many items are in the cart. So we'll need information about the cart here in the products overview screen. We also need access to the cart from inside the product item Dart file, because there we have that shopping cart button here, this one, which allows us to add items to the cart. And that of course means that we need access to our cart provider. And we'll later also have a separate cart screen which shows us, or which allows us to see what's in the cart. So we also need to access the cart from in there. Hence, the cart is another thing that makes sense to be provided in our root widget, because we need it in a couple of screens which are defined up there as well. Now, the problem is we already have a provider here. Now, of course, we could have a nested change notifier provider in here and simply provide our cart here as a value. Would be possible, wouldn't be wrong, wouldn't hurt performance, but gets pretty ugly the more and more providers we add, because we have a deeper and deeper nesting. Thankfully, the provider package has us covered. It gives us a special type of provider which allows us to group multiple providers together. And that's the multi-provider. Multi-provider is a class you can create if you import from the provider package. And multi-provider takes a provider's argument, which is a list of providers. Now, to that providers list, you simply add your providers, like this change notifier provider value. Of course, close that extra parentheses and add a parentheses here after providers, and you're good. So you simply have providers, and next to that, then your child, which will simply receive all these providers. So in child here, you can tap into all providers you set up there. So now you have one change notifier provider here with no child here. It will simply get this child. And we can add another one here now, which receives our cart. And for that, we just have to make sure that we import the cart model or the cart class. So from the providers file, from cart Dart, we need to import this. And with that import added, we can set up this change notifier provider, add the closing parentheses, and we're good. So now we're adding these two providers to the entire child widget tree down there. And that means we can now listen to cart anywhere in the application. Now again, stepping in here from the future, as I mentioned earlier, the recommended way of solving this here when you provide a brand new object is that you don't use the value constructor, but instead the create function in the default constructor of change notifier provider, which simply looks like this. And you should do this for products and also for the cart. So that would be the recommended, the best practice approach. The other approach also works fine here, but again, as mentioned earlier, that is the current best practice of doing it. Hence, of course, I want to show this here. With our cart provider set up here as well, we can start using it. And a good way to start using it is to add items here in product item. That means I want to get access to my cart container, so to say. And I can do this by using provider of, and now of course, with the angle brackets, I refer to cart and not product. And this gives us access to the nearest provided object of type cart, which is this one here in the main Dart file. Now to use the cart class here in products item, we need to import it as always. So we import from providers cart.dart. And with that import added, here we just have to add the context argument, and now we get access to the cart container. Now in the product item here, I'm not interested in changes to the cart. So here I'll set listen to false so that this widget does not rebuild if the cart changes. Because here I only want to dispatch actions, so to say. I only want to tell the cart that I added a new item. I'm not interested in changes to the cart. So down there on our button, we can now call cart add item. And we need to forward some information about the product, which we thankfully have here. Product.id, product.price, and product.title. All of that is available here, and so we can forward it. Now, to see whether that works, it would be nice to output some information about the cart somewhere. And as I mentioned, I want to do that in the product's overview screen. There, next to my pop-up menu button, I want to have an icon button which shows the cart icon, takes us to the cart screen, and also shows a small label that tells us how many items are in the cart. So here, I want to add an icon button with the cart icon and an extra badge. Now, this badge on the icon button is not a widget that would be built into Flutter. Now, to save some time, I'm providing you with one. You find it attached. It's a badge.dart file, and you can simply drag and drop it into your widgets folder. The badge.dart file creates a stateless widget, and in this stateless widget here, let me add a comma here so that this is structured a bit nicer. There, in the end, we get 3 things we can configure: child, a value, and a color which you can set. And then down there I have a stack widget, which is built into Flutter, where I have a couple of children, and essentially there I render a container with a little box decoration, some rounded corners. Then if a color is set, I use that color. Otherwise, I use the default accent color of the theme. Some box constraints to make sure that this label, this badge doesn't grow too big if you have a large value in it. And then here I have my child, which is simply text, where I output the value, which is received as an argument, right? So this is passed in from outside. Align this in the center, set a certain font size. And yeah, so that's essentially my badge. And please note that in this stack here, it does not just have this positioned label, it also adds child in here, which also is a required argument. So it basically is wrapped around some other child which you define. And we can now use this badge widget here in Products Overview by simply importing it from the widgets folder, there from badge.dart. Here, in the place where you want to have that cart icon button, we can use our badge, and as a child, I define what this label should be placed on, and that's my icon button, which receives the icon widget of type icons shopping cart. Then we also need to define which value we want to output on the badge. And that, of course, should be the amount of items we have in the cart. And that's now some information which we need to derive from our cart provider, from this cart class. In the cart class, we of course have our list of items. Now we can also add another getter which returns us an integer which tells us how many items are in there. Again, to move the logic of counting that into our cart class here and not into our widgets. So here I get item count. And now here you have 2 different ways, 2 different approaches of counting. You can either count the amount of entries in this map. Then that means if you have one product with quantity 5 in there, you still only return a count of 1. Or you count the sum of all quantities. So if you have one product in the cart, but that has a quantity of 5, you return 5. Now I want to return the amount of products, not the sum of quantities, but of course you can tweak this to your likings. Here, however, I will simply return _items length. And that's all. Whoops, and don't add parentheses here for getters. So this gives us the item count. Back in the products overview, this means that here in badge, to provide my value, I need to get access to my provided cart class. Now we do provide in the main Dart file. Now we need to set up a listener. We could set up the listener up here at the beginning of build, here in products overview. We could get access to the cart with provider of cart and so on, right? But that means the entire build method here would rerun whenever something changes in the cart. Now, most parts of this product overview screen don't care about that. It's only this little button that cares about it. So the better approach here is to use consumer. And for that, you need to import provider Dart from the provider package into this file. And with consumer, you now define the class you want to listen to. So here we're looking for the next provided object of type card. And for that, to use this class here, we need to import from the providers folder the card Dart file. And now we're setting up a listener to card here. And in consumer, you now get your builder with your context if you should need it, which I don't, with your card object or data then, and also with that extra child. Now it's here where I return this badge. So let's add this here. And value, since I'm now in that builder, can now be retrieved from the card data, or maybe name it just card because that is what it is. And then on that card, we can simply get the item count. Now that's an integer. Value, however, wants a string. So we can simply call toString here. Now on the icon button, we also should add onPressed. And for now, I'll not do anything in here. And up there, since I already used the underscore for the context, you could name this _2 or anything like that. However, I want to use the child here. Because if you watch closely, what do? I change the value here. That depends on the card. The icon button itself and the icon does not depend on it. So rebuilding this just because the card changed is actually a bit of a waste. So I can cut this out of my badge here and on consumer. So next to that builder argument, I now add the child argument there and provide my icon button as a child. This is then passed in here as a child in the builder, and to avoid naming confusion, I'll just name this CH. And now this is what I forward to the child of my badge. Now these are a lot of child elements, right? But child here on the consumer is my icon button. This automatically gets passed into the builder by Flutter and the provider package as the CH argument. So this is in the end what I defined here. The important thing is that it won't be rebuilt when my card changes because it's defined outside of card. I then receive it in here in the builder and I can refer to it here. And badge also has a child argument to which I then pass this static child I defined out here, which simply is done this way so that it doesn't rebuild when card changes. Now if we do a full restart here, I actually get an error. And if we have a look at that error by scrolling up to the beginning, we see that the problem is that the getter length was called on null. So that can only come from one place. That's in the card Dart file where I return items length. Of course, the problem is items here initially is undefined and therefore it has no length property. Solution is simple. You can check whether items is equal to null. And if that's the case, you return 0 here, and otherwise you return items length. That is one simple solution here around this problem. Now this rebuilds. Now you see here, the debug badge is slightly above it, but you see that icon here, or the card icon with that badge. And if I click on add to card here, nothing changes. Why is that? Well, because we forgot something important. You always need to call notify listeners when you change something in your provided classes to which your listeners should react. So here, if I update my card, of course at the end of this add item function here, I have to call notify listeners. Otherwise my changes won't be reflected in the user interface. So now if I save this, if I tap this shopping cart icon here, still nothing. Well, we see that we have an error here. And the error is that contains key was called on null. The problem here simply is that all my nice methods here on items don't work if items is uninitialized as it is here. Simple workaround is to simply initialize this as an empty map, which of course also means that this workaround here isn't really needed anymore. So make sure that items is an empty map here initially, and now if you reload with that and with notify listeners added, now if I click on my card icons, you see the number in the badge now changes. If I click on the same icon multiple times, it doesn't change because in my implementation here, I'm counting the amount of products in the cart, not the sum of quantities. But if I click on different products, then it increases. So this shows how we can now manage the cart in our provided class here, how we do this efficiently, and how we can use that information in different widgets. Now, as a next step, let's actually make sure we can click that card icon here and go to a separate screen where we can see all the content of our card. So let's work on a card screen now to which we can navigate. For this, in the screens folder, let's add a new card_screen.dart file, or whatever you want to name it. And in there, I'll add a stateless widget, card screen, and simply import, as always, material.dart from the Flutter package. Now, as always, it's totally up to you how you build that screen, what you want to show there, and so on. On my card summary screen here, in the end, I want to show a little box that shows us the total amount and allows us to order all the items in the card. And below that, I want to have a list of card items where we can also swipe the icons to dismiss and delete them. So since this will make up the entire screen, let's add scaffold here as a root widget in this stateless widget here, in our own widget. And of course, let's add an app bar here, where I say your card. Whoops, should be on the title though. So here on the title of this app bar, I'll add a text widget where I say your card, anything like that. And of course, then we'll have a body in here, which shows the content of our card. Now, as I said, I want to have a box with a summary of the card, and then below that, all card items. So since there are two items, two elements above each other, we'll need a column for sure. Like this. And column takes a children, as you learned, and the first child here will be a card, and I'll take the built-in card widget to have some nice built-in styling out of the box. Add a little bit of margin around it with the margin argument on card, and I'll use edge insets all 15 maybe. You can of course play around with that value to find the value that best suits your needs. And the child, the child here of my card will now be a row, because I'll have a couple of pieces of information next to each other. Actually, the direct child will be a padding, because I want to have some padding in the card with edge insets all 8 maybe. And then here I'll have a child, which now is my row of elements. So a row of items inside of my card, surrounded by some padding. And now in that row, I essentially want to have a text widget where I say total, because I'm showing the total here. And I'll add a little bit of style there and give this a text style object, therefore, where I want to set the font size to 20. And of course, that should be inside of the text widget, like this. So give this a font size of 20 maybe. And next to the text, I want to have a sized box with a width of 10 to add some spacing. Because now next to that, I'll add a widget which we haven't used before, the chip widget, which is also a little bit like our badge, our label, an element with rounded corners, which you can use to display information. The chip takes a label, and that is a widget, or that requires a widget, and I'll use a text widget here where I want to show my sum, my total sum of the items I have in the card. For that, of course, we need to calculate the card total. And as before, it's always a good idea to not do something like this in your widgets, but move such logic into your models, into your classes. So here I'll move it into the card class with a new getter. There I'll return double with a getter, double get total amount, or whatever you want to name it. And here I want to return the total of all my card items. Now for that, to return my total here, I'll create a new helper variable, total, which is 0.0 initially. And then here I want to go through all the elements in my card. So on my items, underscore items, with for each I can execute a function on every entry in that map, and it will receive that entry as an argument. To be precise, it will receive the key and then the value for that entry. So my card item, so to say. And then in that function I can do something. So it runs this function for every item in my map, and this is a map of card items in the end. So here I can then take my existing total, which I initialize with 0, and simply add something to it with this plus equal shortcut, which adds something to the value and then stores the new value back in that variable. So I add something to that value, and that something is card item dot price times card item dot quantity. So I go through all my card items and then I calculate the total by multiplying all the quantities with the prices. And then that total is what I return here. So that's my total amount. And in the card screen, I need that total amount. Therefore, in the card screen, I need to listen to changes in my cart. And I'll do this here with provider off because I'm fine with rebuilding everything when something in the cart changes. Theoretically, the app bar, of course, doesn't need to rebuild if something in the cart changes. It doesn't really hurt, though. You could, of course, just wrap the parts that really are affected. But to save some lines of code, and because it doesn't have a huge impact here, I'll just set up a general listener here directly at the beginning of build. And there I reach out to my cart with provider, for which you need to import the provider package. And you will also need to import your cart model, your cart class. So with provider of, for the type cart of context. This gives me access to the cart. With that access, I also set up my listener. I'm fine with listening to changes here. I want to rebuild when something changes. So here I can then access cart total amount and convert this to a string. But actually that won't be required here because what I actually pass here to the text widget is a string with some string interpolation where I access between my curly braces cart total amount. ToString is then called automatically, and in front of that I want to show the $sign. So to use it as a $sign, we need to escape with a backslash, and then here this shows the $sign, and this here sets up string interpolation where it outputs the total amount. Now that chip in which I'm outputting this can also be configured to get some background color. And there I want to use my primary theme color. So with theme of context, primary color, I do set up this background color. And with that, we already have something that would be interesting to view. So to reach that card screen, we need to be able to go there. And I want to route there with a named route. So I'll add a static const route name here at the top of the card screen class, at the top of our widget here. And give this a name of /cart. That name is, of course, totally up to you, as you learned in the navigation module. And in main Dart, we can now register this. Here in the routes table, we add our cart screen. And for that, you need to add an import here from /screens, cart screen Dart. Then down there, you can refer to cart screen route name as your key. And then in that builder method, which Flutter calls for you, you create a new card screen object. So now with the card screen registered, we can go there from inside our products overview when we tap this card button. So here in this method here, I want to use navigator of context and then use push named to go to the card screen. So there I refer to card screen, and for that you need to import that screen here. So add an import pointing at /card screen.dart. And with that import added here, down there where I create the route, I refer to card screen.route name and push that named route. Let's give this a try. Let's click on the cart, and I'm taken to the cart. You see we have nothing in the cart and hence a total value of 0. If I now add this item by clicking on the cart button twice, I have 119.8 here, which makes sense if we have a look at our products, because what I chose is the trousers, and the trousers have a price of $59.99. I clicked on the cart icon twice, so I added 2 of them, and hence the total here makes sense. It's 2 trousers. So that works. Now, what would be nice here is a changed color of the text. So in the card screen here, in our chip, on the text here, I can add a style, a text style here, and give this a different color. And there I want to reach out to the theme and take my primary text theme, and there my title color. So only the color which would normally be assigned to title text elements that have the primary text theme. And that by default then uses white as a contrast color to the dark purple background. Would also be nice to have some space between, and that's very easy to do, as you learned, of course. On the row here, which holds the different items where I want to have space between, we can set a main axis alignment of main axis alignment dot space between. And what this ensures is that it, well, adds space between total and that chip here. That chip alone is pretty boring, however. Next to the chip, I also want to have a button that allows us to place the order. So next to the chip, I'll add a flat button where the child is a text widget, where I say order now, something like that, all caps maybe. And on pressed, I'll not do anything for the moment because we have no functionality to place orders yet. I'll give it a text color though, which I get from my theme, and there I simply want to use the primary color. So this adds a flat button, which we now also see here, the order now button. Now, thanks to space between, by the way, we don't really need that sized box with the width here though, because we can simply distribute the space like that. And if you want to make sure that both the chip and the order now button are pushed all the way to the right, but this total is pushed all the way to the left, there's a special widget you can add between the text and the chip. That's the spacer widget, which is built into Flutter. And if you add that, that basically takes up all the available space and reserves it for itself, and therefore we get this look, well, we have here. So now we have that summary card. Let's next display the card items below that though. To have some items below our summary card, I'll first of all add a sized box with a height of 10 to have some spacing. And then add a list view here, which should render all the items in our card. Now you learned that a list view directly inside of a column doesn't work, but all we have to do is wrap it with an expanded widget, which ensures that we take as much space as is left in this column instead of as much space as you can get, and then use our list view in here. Now we could have an infinite amount of card items, so I'll use list view builder here to build this for potential performance improvements. And as you learned, that takes two important things, the item count and the item builder. Now the item count needs to know how many items we have in our card. Conveniently, I have access to the card here, thanks to provider auth. So down there, we just need card.item count. And the way I set this up, this simply gives us the amount of items. If you use the different logic here, where you summed up the quantities, then of course you can't use your item count getter, and instead here you would have to use items length, right? So that is in the end the logic you want to have here, items length. Now besides the item count, we need the item builder, which builds us the list entries here, and there we get context and we get the index, and we need to return the widget that should be built for every item in the card. Now we could do this inline, but just as with the product item in the product grid, I'll add a card item dart file in the widgets folder, and in there create a new stateless widget, which is our card item, and that's the item I want to build. So for that, let's import material dart from the Flutter package, and let's now define how such a card item should look like. As always, your imagination is the limit here. You can build this however you want. I will simply create a couple of cards. So every card item will be in a card. Around that card, I want to have some margin. And now here I'll use a symmetric margin distribution, which means I want to have different margins left and right and top and bottom. So horizontally, I want to have a margin of 15, which matches the margin I set up for my summary card up there in the card screen. And vertically, I want to have a margin of only 4, so between my different card items now. Now the child in that card will be a padding, so to set up some padding inside of the card, where I use edge insets all 8. And then the child of the padding is the actual content for each card item. And there I'll simply use a list tile, but of course you can use any widget or any structure you want there. You can build your own row, column, container, whatever you need. Here in my list tile, at the beginning, I want to have the sum for this card item we're displaying. And I want to display one list item for every product we have in the cart and then show its price and its quantity. So here, I'll use a circle avatar again to display the information about the price with an escaped $sign and then some interpolation. And now that's simply some data which I expect to get in this card item. There, we'll need a couple of pieces of information. We'll need to get the ID of that card item. We'll need to get the price. We'll need to get the quantity. And we'll probably also need the title of the product. So card item will, of course, have a constructor, again, with named or positional arguments, where all these things, all these pieces of information need to be provided. And I'm going with a positional constructor here. Now with this configured down there, I of course simply want to refer to my price. And therefore, since it's only one word, we don't need the curly braces. And toString is called automatically there. Now as a title, I want to show the title of the product. So another text widget where I simply refer to title. And as subtitle, we could calculate a total price, which automatically is quantity times the price. So we could have a text in here where we say total, then an escape $sign to really print a $sign. And then with string interpolation, calculate the total amount for this item. And that will simply be the price times the quantity. Right? Let's wrap this into parentheses here. And last but not least, as a trailing element here, I'll just output the quantity we have so that we can also see that. Another text widget where I simply want to output the quantity and then an X to show it as a multiplicator sign. So this is how a card item could look like, how my card item will look like. In a card screen, we can now use that. So in card screen, let's import from the widgets folder the card item Dart file. And with that imported, it's the card item I want to return in the builder down there. So in the item builder here, we can return the card item. And of course, we now have to pass all that data into card item, which we are expecting there. So ID, price, quantity, and title. That is what we expect here. That is what we need to pass in. Of course, you could now also set up a provider for every card item if that would be a standalone listenable provided class in your app, which it isn't for me. Card item here doesn't have a change notifier. We could, of course, provide it without that, but don't really need to do that, actually. I'm fine with having my card item, which simply receives the data I want to pass in here. Because here in card screen, of course, we do have our card, and there we do have the card items. And therefore, in here, I can simply pass in card items for the given index .id. And then repeat the same for the, what's the second thing? Card item takes the price, quantity, and title. So price, quantity, title. So here I can then access the price and then also card items, quantity, and last but not least, the title. Now we have one issue here. Card item is now a name I use twice. Here in the card Dart file in providers, I have a card item class. And here in the card item Dart file, I also have a card item class. Now in my card screen, I'm importing both. I'm importing my provider's card Dart file, which has one card item, and I'm importing my card item Dart file, which has the other one. Now in such cases, there are a couple of solutions. You could add as here and name this CI, for example, and that would be a prefix which you could now use. So now you would use here ci.cardItem, and now Dart would be able to know from which file you want to use card item. So using a prefix is one option. Or maybe you only need one feature of a file in another file, and that's the case here. From card Dart, I'm not interested in the card item in my card screen. Instead, in the card screen, I'm only interested in the card class, which is part of the card Dart file. Oh man, that are many cards. But I'm only interested in this class here, in my card Dart file, in the card screen file. So here we can use the show keyword and then let Dart know that we're only interested here in card. And it won't import the card item from the card Dart file. And therefore, it will only import it from the card item Dart file, and we avoid that name clash. With that, let's do a full refresh. And let's see whether that works. Let's add the trousers and the red shirt to the card. Go to the card screen. And I get an error. The getter ID was called a null. Now the total seems to be good, but what's wrong with the ID here, which I execute on card items? It's a subtle error, and it's related to the fact that card items here, of course, refers to our map, right? In the card class, items, which we return here with the items getter, is a map. Now here I'm actually interested in the values which are stored in that map. Hence here on card items you can access a values property, which gives you an iterable, which you can convert to a list. And now that's actually the list of values we need here, on which we can then access the ith element. So that's actually what I want to extract here. Values to list on my card items so that I operate on, well, a list of values so that I only work with the concrete values stored in the map. And now there I'll then have ID and so on available. So with that, if we go back to the app and we now start adding items to the cart again, now we can see them here. Now to fit the labels or the prices here into our circle avatars, let's go to the card item, to the widget there, and then in circle avatar, we can of course wrap that text with fitted box, which should ensure that this actually fits in there. So now if I add a couple of items to the cart, this looks better, and now we are squeezing this into our circle avatar. We can also see here, we see the individual price, here we see the sum, the title, the quantity. That looks decent to me. Obviously, you can always fine-tune this to your likings. I'm happy with this. Maybe we add some padding around this text here. So around that fitted box, let's add a new widget padding here with padding set to edge insets all 10 maybe, or I think that's too much. Let's go with 5. And now if we give that a try, yeah, now it looks even better. So now we have this setup here, which works for me. Let's next make sure that we can actually also swipe here to remove items from the card. Swipe to remove is a common pattern in app development. We haven't used it such far, so now it's definitely time to implement it. I want to make sure that in our card item here, the card items which we are rendering can be, well, removed when we swipe them, removed from the list, removed from the card. Now in my app here, and that's of course always also something you can define however you want, swiping means the entire item is gone. So if we had it in the cart 3 times, it's now removed entirely. I won't add a functionality to remove single items. Obviously, you could do this as a bonus task, but for the purposes of this course and demo, I'll focus on removing the entire element here. So how can we implement this? Thankfully, Flutter got us covered. There is a special widget which we can add, which we can wrap around our card here actually, and that is the dismissible widget. That's a widget which is built into Flutter, which automatically gives us a nice animation and will remove the element it wraps from the UI. Internally, this is a stateful widget therefore, and as you can imagine, it does a lot of complex heavy lifting for managing the animation and so on, and therefore this needs a key to work correctly to avoid issues where it then displays the list of which this offness part is rendered incorrectly. Here you should render or use a value key, and the perfect value for this is of course the ID of our card item, because that's guaranteed to be unique. Now on dismissible, you can also define a background which is shown behind that element once you start swiping. And here I'll render a container with a color where I use my theme error color, which is a red color. With that added, if you go back and you add an item to the cart, you see I can now swipe this, right? In both directions, and if I swipe enough, this indeed is gone. Now, it's not really deleted, it's just deleted on the user interface for now, which is why it's back when I go back. But we can listen, of course, to that it's gone effect and then also update it in our data to remove it from there as well. So we added dismissible. Now, there are a couple of things you can configure there. For one, it would be nice to understand what it does when we remove that. So here in that container, I'll also add a little child, and that will be an icon. And there I want to use the delete icon and give that a color of colors white. Also give it a size of 40 so that we can see that. And to position it correctly in the container, I will add alignment, the alignment argument, to the container and set this to alignment.center right to align it in the center vertically, but on the right horizontally. Also add some padding to the container with edge insets only on the right of 20. And with that, let's see how that works. If I save this and I add, let's say, 2 items to the cart here, now you see we have that trash icon here, which kind of indicates what's about to happen when we continue swiping here. Now, if you want to make sure that the background is only behind the cart, you can, of course, also add the same margin you added on the overall card here. And that means I just copy that edge insets set up from down there on the card. And now if I add 2 card items there, the swipe effect is only behind the card. So that's nice. Would also be nice to only swipe from right to left, let's say, not in the other direction. Thankfully, you can restrict this as well on dismissible. So here on dismissible, outside of the background argument. So here you can set the direction argument to set the direction in which this can be dismissed. And there you can provide a dismiss direction dot. And now here we need end to start, which typically is right to left. And if you set this and you add an item to the card, you see now swiping right to left still works, but swiping in the other direction does not work. Now, of course, we also need to define what happens once we dismissed it visually, because that only affects the UI, but of course we also want to change something in our data then. And for that we can define onDismissed, which executes a function which we define here once it's done. In that function we receive the direction in which it was dismissed, in case you're allowing different directions and you want to do something different based on the different directions. It's not the case for us here. We always want to remove the card item, but if you had different options, different swiping directions, then you could check the direction here based on the direction you're getting here as an argument automatically. But since we only have one direction, we can go right ahead and remove the item from our card. For that, in the card provider, we first of all need to add a new method, remove item. And the easiest way of getting rid of an item here is to simply receive the ID of the product it belongs to. So here we expect our product ID, and that is useful because we use that product ID as a key in our map, if you remember. That's what we assign as a key in the map. And thankfully, on maps, we also have a remove method to which we pass a key, and then the value for that key will be removed. Thereafter, we call notify listeners, and we're done. This is the easiest way of getting rid of an entry in a map. So that's what I want to call here in the card item. And for that, we need to tap into our card container, into our provider. And hence, we need to import the provider package in here from provider Dart from the provider package. And of course, import our card model here from the providers folder. With that, down here, we can set up provider of card, pass in the context, and then simply call remove item. Now, where do we get the product ID from? We can simply expect it as an input to this card item widget. So here we can expect a product ID argument here, maybe as the second argument, doesn't matter. And now in the place where you render the card items, so in the card screen, you also need to pass this as a second argument. And there you get that from card items. And just as you have a values property to give you a list of values, you can also get a list of keys. And then for that given index we're looking for, we simply pass in the key as a value to card item. So with that, we pass the key for the item we're looking at into our card item widget, and that key is the product ID. So we get the product ID here now, and with that we can use the product ID down there. Now important, I don't really want to set up a listener to the card here, so I'll set listen to false. I really just need access to the card to dispatch my action here. Whoops, listen false here on the auth method. I don't want to set up a permanent listener. With that, if we go back to our application and we add a couple of items to the cart, we see them here. And now, watch the total up there when I swipe this card item. You see, the total updated because now it was really removed from the cart, which is also proven by the fact that if I go back and then I go back into the cart, it's still gone. So now we really not just update this visually with the help of dismissible, but also in our data with the help of provider auth and our card provider, our card container. And we're not listening here in the card item, but of course we're listening to changes in the card screen, and therefore we rebuild the card screen when our card changes, and that's exactly what I want to do because I want to rebuild the total and also my list here. Our application is taking shape and we're heavily using the provider package and the provider pattern, which is normal in bigger or anything but very trivial applications, because managing our state like this is so much easier and more convenient than doing it in the main Dart file and passing data around manually, which is very error prone and cumbersome. Now in this app there are a couple of missing pieces. Order now doesn't do anything. If we go to a detail page, we'll also only see the title, we see no content there. So these are the things I want to work on. I want to make sure that when we go to the detail page, we see some details about this element we selected. And on the card page, if I click order now, I actually want to place this order and store it as an order somewhere. Now let's start with the detail page, which is pretty boring compared to what we did before, because now we'll not really work with provider. We already are fetching our product here by its ID, and there's little else I need to do. But of course, we'll have to add a couple of widgets here to output more information about our selected product. So let's add a body to the scaffold here in the product detail screen. And in there, as always, it's up to you how you want to style this, what you want to show. I'll add a container here with a height of 300 in which I want to output the image of that product we selected. So the child of that container is simply a network image with image.network. And the information, well, we get that from the loaded product. That's where we get our URL from. So loaded product.image URL is what I use here. And on that network image, I also set the fit to boxfit.cover to fit that image nicely into the container. With that, if we save this and we go to the detail page, here's our image. Now the container should also take the full width, so I'll set the width to double infinity. And now, well, that is what I get. Now below that container here, I also want to output the description, so the details about this product and the price. So therefore, this container should actually go into a column. And actually that column should go into a single child scroll view so that it is scrollable in case the space does not suffice on our page. And now below the container, in that list of widgets we pass to column, I'll have a sized box with a height of 10 to add some spacing here. And then I want to have a text which holds the price of that element. So here I want to have my loaded, or actually with a dollar sign in front of it. And then some string interpolation my loaded product.price like this, and give this a little bit of styling by creating a text style here on the fly. And of course, you could set up a general title theme for that if you wanted to. I'll just give this a color of colors gray and a font size of 20, let's say. And below that text here, I want to have my description. So I'll add a sized box here as well with a height of 10. And below that sized box, I'll add a text widget, which outputs my loaded product.description. And where I set text align to text align.center. I also want to make sure that soft wrap is set to true so that this wraps into new lines if there is no more space. And I'll wrap it into a container which has a width of double infinity to take as much space as we have on the screen, but with some extra padding where I have edge insets symmetric and only assign horizontal padding of, let's say, 10. And with all of that, this is what I have here. Obviously, not too fancy. You can obviously change this, fine-tune this, add different colors, whatever you need. It's not really the focus of this module, obviously, since we focus on state management here. But nonetheless, a nice detail page here where we can view more information about the product before we then favorite it or put it into our cart here, like this. So what's missing now? Well, obviously, I want to make sure that when we have items in the cart, we can hit that order button here and add them to our orders screen. And for this, we need to manage orders. Now, in my opinion, it makes sense to add a new class, a new provided class for that, because it doesn't really fit into products. There, I want to manage the products we can work with. Doesn't fit into cart, because there I want to manage only my cart, not the orders. And product here is just a single product we use in products. We could, of course, also move that product class into the product start file. So I'll add a new file, orders.dart, where I want to manage the orders we have. In there, we can create a new class, orders, and I'll use with change notifier imported from Flutter foundation.dart, because of course we will provide that, and we might have places in the app where we want to listen to changes. Now in there, I want to manage some orders, unsurprisingly, and for that, of course, we first of all need to define how our order should look like. Just as with the cart, here I'll create my order item right inside the same file. You could do it in a separate file. And each order should have an ID, should have an amount, so the total amount, so the quantity of items times the price, so to say. I also want to find out which products were ordered. So I want to get a list of my products, and they're actually of the cart items to be precise, because I also want to find out which quantity was ordered and so on. So I'll import my cart Dart file here so that I can use the cart item class here, and then have my products here, and also the time at which this order was placed. That's also something that's worth storing. Then let's add the constructor, and I will go with named arguments here to assign values to all these properties. Like this. Whoops, and that should be order item, of course. And also, just as we did it earlier, I'll mark all these arguments here as required. So that's our order item. In the orders class, we'll now have a list of such items. So down there, we can add list of type order item, or which holds an order item. Orders, which is empty initially, let's say. And then here we can already add a getter, which returns our order items, named orders, which returns a copy. Again, by using or by creating a new list with square brackets, and then using the spread operator to take some items and move them into this new list. So here, the items which are part of orders. And I'm doing this so that from outside this class, we can't edit orders. Now what I need here is, of course, an add order method, which returns nothing, but which is executed when we click that Order Now button here on the card screen. The idea here is to then add all the content of the card into one order. So I should probably get a list of card items, which I'll name card products here, as an argument. Maybe already get the total. If I already have that calculated, I don't have to redo it. And then with that, we can add this as a new order. So here we can then reach out to orders, to that list, and add it as a new order, or actually use insert with index 0 to add it as the first element in the list. Add will always add it at the end of the list. With insert 0, we add it at the beginning of the list, so that more recent orders are at the beginning of the list, but that's totally up to you. So here I'll use insert 0 to add the new order at the beginning of the orders list and move all existing orders, well, one index ahead to the end. And then here the element which should be added is of course a new order item. And there we need to define an ID, and for now I'll use datetime now to string to get a pseudo unique ID. Then we also need to define our amount here. That's the total which I'm getting as an argument. Then we have the current timestamp, and there we can just use datetime now. And we also need to pass in our products, and that are just the card products which I'm receiving. So with that, we're adding a new order. And now in case we got someone who's listening, we want to call notify listeners so that any places in the app which depend on orders are now updated. Placing an order also means that we want to clear the card, of course, because we ordered all elements, so the card should be cleared. So in the card Dart file, we can add a new method, clear card, or just clear, whatever you want to name it. And there I will set items back to an empty map and then call notify listeners. We can now start using that. First of all, we need to provide our orders class, right? Because I plan on using that in different places in the app, either to dispatch actions like add a new order or to listen to my orders or fetch my orders. So where should we provide it? If we have a look at the main Dart file, we'll definitely need orders in the card screen, or at least in a part of the card screen there. And we'll add a new screen soon, which shows all orders. So therefore, we'll register a brand new screen, which definitely needs access to the orders. And therefore, we also need to provide the orders here in the root app. Just because it's important, keep in mind, this does not mean that the entire app rebuilds when something changes there, because it's not the provider which causes a rebuild, but the listener. And the listeners are not here in the main widget. They are in different widgets. For example, in the card screen, where we have our card provider and so on. These are the listeners which rebuild the UI. Therefore, in main Dart, we can now add another provider. Here, our change notifier provider with .value, where the value is actually a new instance of orders. And for that, of course, we need to import our orders.dart file from the providers folder. With that imported, we create a new instance here and provide that as a value. And with that, we can listen to orders from anywhere in our application. And of course, you already know it, just as recommended before, you shouldn't necessarily use the value constructor here. So just to re-emphasize this, the recommended approach here, again, as before, would be that you use the create function here in the normal constructor function of the change notifier provider for products, for card, and also here for orders. Or of course the builders function if you're using provider package version 3. So that's the recommended approach. Again, I mentioned it before, it's just really important to me. The other approach also works, but that's the better approach. The first place where I want to tap into my provided orders object is in the card screen, of course, when we do press that order now button. This here. In on pressed, I want to use my orders and call add order. So I will need to get my orders class here because I'll need to provide it here. And I want to provide it down there in onPressed with providers of orders, and of course pass context as an argument. And it's not providers, but just provider. I can call add order and now pass my data to that order. And the data I need to pass here is the content of my cart and the total. It's pretty easy to do because we got access to the cart here and we can get both pieces of information from the cart. So here I pass cart.items and then simply values here to list to convert the cart item objects into a list of cart item objects instead of passing the whole map. So I'm just passing a list of my concrete cart item objects. And for the total, well, we got cart.total amount, right? So that's in the end what I pass here as a total for the order. Important, I don't want to listen to that orders provider because here I'm not interested in changes in my orders. I only want to dispatch an action. So I'll set listen to false here, to not listen to changes in my orders. And now with that, we're dispatching this. I also want to clear my cart here, and I can do this on my cart. The cart variable here is coming from this listener. And there I want to call clear. And now, of course, here, up there, I am listening to my cart. And that's important because clear will now actually clear all elements from the cart and then call notify listeners. And that is, of course, something which should be reflected in the cart screen. So it's good that I'm listening to changes in cart here, but not to changes in orders. Let's give that a try. Do a full refresh here maybe. And then let's add a couple of items to the cart here. And let's click order now. And you see, this clears the cart. We get no confirmation about our order that was placed, so that's probably something we should add. And of course, we can't view our orders. So that's the missing piece, that we now also need our orders page, which allows us to see our orders. For now, I want to make sure that we can reach our orders page. And for that, we first of all need to add one. So let's add a new screen, the orders screen. Therefore, the orders screen.dart file, which has a stateless widget in it, orders screen. And there we import material.dart as always. And the goal there is to output information about our orders. Since this will fill an entire page, I'll use scaffold here and add an app bar with a title, which holds a text widget where I say your orders, something like that. And then the body is, of course, the interesting part. There, I want to output information about my orders that were placed. And each order then in turn contains information about the different products that were part of that order, of course. We definitely need to get access to our orders, therefore, and hence we need to import from the providers folder our orders.dart file, where the orders class is defined. And then here in the build method, we can get access to orders with provider, for which you need to import the provider Dart file from the provider package of orders, and then pass context as an argument here. And now here in the body, I want to render a list view with the builder constructor because we don't know how many orders we'll have. So to improve performance, potentially at least, I'll use the builder. And the item count, not the builder, the item count is of course taken from orders. And there I also named my getter orders. Now orders.orders sounds a bit strange, so I'll name this variable here order data. Then we have order data.orders. And there the length is of course what defines the amount of items that have to be built. And then we have the item builder, which should go ahead and build the single list items. And as always, it gets a context and an index for that. Now, as always, we could add all the widget content for a single item here into the orders screen, or we create a new separate widget. And I did it already for cart and product items, so I'll do it here as well. Have my order item in a separate file. create a stateless widget, order item, and import material Dart there. Now, as always, it's up to you how you structure and style this. For me, an order will be in a card widget. And I want to add some margin around each card, so around each order with edge insets all of 10. And then we need a child in that card, and there I'll actually have a column. And that's just how I will structure the items in my order. Because, and that's the special thing about this, this should actually be an expandable card where we can click a button to see more details. And therefore here in this column, in my children, I'll first of all have a list tile as the first element in that column, so the topmost element. And there I want to have a title, which is a text widget, where I want to show the total amount it cost us. So output $$ to print the $sign, and then string interpolation to output the order amount. For that, we need to get access to our order data. And here in an order item, I expect to get that data from outside. So here we should get our full order item, let's say, of type order. Now for that, we of course need to import our order item or our provider's orders.dart file where the order item class is defined. Now we'll have a name clash which we had before too. We have order item here as a widget name, but then we also have order item as a class name here in the orders.dart file. Now I showed you two workarounds, the prefix or by using the show keyword. Show doesn't help us because we now need the class which has the name clash, but we can use a prefix here as ord, for example, and then here we use ord.order item to tell Dart to which concrete order item class we're referring. And now this is fixed. And of course now we use order item, so this order item here now, to define a constructor where we assign a value to order. So now I expect to get my order here, and therefore of course I have my amount, my total amount in there as well. Now in that list tile, below the title, I also want to have a subtitle where I show the date of the order. And for that, I want to bring back a package which we used earlier in the course, the Intel package, which you install by going to its page on pubdev, grabbing the version there. So that's the Intel package there. And then in your pubspec.yaml file, you simply add that below your dependencies. And this gives you the Intel package, which helps you with formatting dates. And then back in the order item widget, you can simply import package:intel/intel.dart. And now in the place where you want to output a formatted date, you can use date format and either use one of the pre-configured constructors to get different formats or provide your own one as a pattern to the normal date format constructor here. And there the pattern I'll provide is dd YYY to have the day represented by 2 figures, the month here, then the year by 4 figures, and then even hour and minute with a colon in between. That's just one format I like to use here. And then call format and pass in your order date time. And that should do the trick and output the date time below the title. And now trailing, I want to have a button which we can press to expand this order. For that, I'll add an icon button. And the icon there will be an icon widget where I use the expand more button. Now on pressed, I want to do the logic for expanding this, but that's a second step. Let's first of all see whether that works. So let's build this order item for every order we have. For that, let's head back to the orders screen and simply import from the widgets folder and there from order item. And with that order item imported here, that's exactly what we need to build here, right? So let's build our order item. Now again, here we'll have a similar clash of names as we had it before. Here, however, the difference is that from the orders.dart file, I don't need the order item, but only the orders class. So we can again use show orders to only import that from this file. And then we'll import the order item class from the order item Dart file. Therefore, here we can instantiate this. And here we need to forward the entire order. Well, that's not too hard. We got our order data orders here, and we forward the order for the index we got at hand. So with that, we're building the order items in our orders screen. We now, of course, need a way of reaching it. And I want to use a site drawer for that. Now, definitely feel free to, of course, build your own one, and thereafter watch the next video where I will do it together with you. But, well, as I just said, in the next video we'll do it together, but that's also nice practice. We learned all about adding a drawer in the navigation module of this course, so definitely try this on your own first, and then we'll do it together in the next lecture. We need a drawer to switch between our orders screen and our products screen here, our products overview screen. And I want to use the same drawer in both widgets. Therefore, I'll add a new widget, which I'll name app_drawer. But of course, you can name this however you want. In there, I'll have a stateless widget, app drawer. And as always, import material.dart. Now, it's totally up to you how you build that drawer. It typically should use the drawer widget, though, with which Flutter ships, because that gives you the general look and the background, the overlay effect, and so on. So that is something you should use. But what you have in there, that's totally up to you. Now, here I'll add a column with a couple of children, a couple of child widgets. And one thing I will add here, which we haven't done before, and therefore it's absolutely no problem if you didn't do that. There is no way you could have known that. I will add an app bar in here. You could also build your own complex container, as we did it in the navigation section. But to save some time, I'll add an app bar in here with a title where I say, hello, friend, whatever you want. And important, I'll add automatically imply leading and set this to false. What this does is simply it means it will never add a back button here, because that wouldn't work in here, and therefore it should never display one. Even if it thinks that you can go back, it shouldn't show one. So that's the topmost widget in my column here. Below that, I'll add a divider, this nice little horizontal line, and then add a list tile, which is an entry in that drawer. The first list tile will get a leading element or a leading widget, which is an icon widget with the icon of the shop icon here, because it should lead us back to our products overview page. So here I'll add a title of shop, because that is indeed where we will go. Now, on tapping this, I want to use my navigator and indeed go back to the root route, which is just / if you remember. Push replacement named is correct then. So I just want to go back to the root route to my home page, so to say. Now I'll repeat that pattern of having a divider and a list tile, and the second list tile here actually gets a payment icon, because that should take me to my orders. So there I'll say orders, and that will go to, well, to a new name which we have to add to the orders screen. So on the orders screen there, we can add a static const route name, which could be just /orders, for example. As always, this name is totally up to you. But now assigning this name here in the orders screen allows us to use it here when we push to it. And of course, for that, we have to register it here in the main Dart file too. So let's start with registering this. Let's import that screen from the screens folder, the orders screen. And now in the routes table, in our main Dart file there, we can use the orders screen route name as the key. And then here we'll build that orders screen like this. And we can also now use it in the drawer. So in the drawer, indeed, I now want to import from the screens folder my orders screen so that I can use its route name here. So when I want to push to it, here I use orders screen.route name. So this is it. This is what I want to add to the drawer for now. Yours very likely looks totally different, but that's fine too, of course. And now let's use the drawer. That's the interesting part, of course, in the products overview screen and in the orders screen. In the products overview screen, here we have the app bar, and below the app bar, before the body maybe, but the order doesn't matter here, I add my order and I refer to my app drawer, which is that new widget I worked on, which you have to import here therefore. Now my IDE added it, but not in the way I want that. So let me use a relative path there, go to the widgets folder and import app drawer. And with that imported, we got it here. Let's do the same in the orders screen. There on the orders screen, I also want to add the drawer here. And for that, add an import to this newly added widget, the app drawer Dart file here in the orders screen so that we can render it here. With that, if we do a full refresh, we see that drawer icon here and we can go to orders. We can go back to the shop. And if I now add items here to the cart and I click order now, if I then go to my orders, indeed, here I see information about that order. I can now also expand this, but this doesn't work yet. So this is the next piece of functionality I want to add, of course. And I also want to add some slashes here in the date. Let me actually do that first real quick. In the order item here, add slashes like this. And you can also switch month and day if that's more convenient to you, of course. We're nearing the end of this module. The missing piece is that this order item here should be expandable. Now it's gone because I changed something on the screen. But if I place an order here with order now and I go to orders, this button here should actually expand this order and show us detailed information about which products were part of that order. That means that in the order item, which is that element we're rendering here in that list, I want to change what I display depending on whether that icon was clicked or not. And that screams for a stateful widget. And that's important, for a stateful widget, not for something we want to manage inside of a class we provide with the provider package. Because we're again back to that slide, and whereas orders and the cart and the products are all on the left side here, app-wide state, or at least state that affects multiple widgets, the question whether we are viewing the details or not is definitely a local state thing. Our shop page, our cart page, doesn't care a bit about whether we expanded the state or expanded the information for a single order or not. So that's something we want to manage inside of a single widget, and therefore we use the default widget state management tool, which is using a stateful widget. So here in the order item, we can use the refactoring tool to convert this to a stateful widget. And in the state class here, we can now manage or add a new property, expanded, which initially is false, and which should be set to true when we click this button here. So here we can call set state, and in there set expanded actually to what it's currently not, with the exclamation mark in front of that value. So if it's currently true, we set it to false. If it is false, we set it to true. And set state, of course, so that the UI updates. That icon should also change based on it. Here we can check expanded, and if it is true, then I actually want to show the icon's expand less icon to shrink it again, and only show the expand more icon if we, well, would see more details. So if we haven't expanded yet. And now we can use expanded here because remember, we're in a column. Thus far, I only added one element to the column. Well, this is exactly the reason why I did this, because now I want to be able to show more details by simply adding another element below that list tile. For that, I use this in list if statement, which Dart 2.2.2 added, by using an if statement here right inside of my list, which either adds nothing to the list if it is false, if the condition yields false, or which adds an item I have to return inside of the if statement to the outer list, so to the list of column widgets. And the condition I want to check here is simply expanded. So if expanded is true, then it will add a new widget to that column list of widgets, otherwise it will not. The widget I want to add conditionally here is simply a container with a height that depends on the amount of items we have in the list up to a certain point. For that, I'll first of all import another package that's actually built into Dart, and that's Dart Math, because that gives us a min function which I can use here to use the minimum height out of two values. Either widget.order. We have to use widget now because we're in the state object. This gives us access to the connected widget. And in that connected widget, we have that order. So widget order gives me access to the order. And there I want to get the amount of products, which I get with products length. So the amount of products that were registered in there. And then I multiply that with, let's say, 20 and add a base height of maybe 100. Yeah, maybe 100. So that's the first possible value. That ensures that we never add a too big container, a too high container, if we only have one product, for example. But if we have 10 different products in there, I also don't want to expand this infinitely and have a super big container. And therefore, the other value is, let's say, 180. So now min will pick either of these two values here. It will calculate this, and if this is smaller, then it will take that. Or if that gets very large and this is smaller, it will take 180 as a height here for our container. Now important, min requires doubles here, so let's simply add .0 here after 20, which I multiply with the length. So this entire container will be attached if we're in expanded mode. Of course, I then also want to have something in the container. So let's add a child here, and the part inside of the container. Well, that will be a list view because it should be scrollable in case we have many items and we take this value here as a height for the container. Then not all items will fit into the container, hence they need to be scrollable. And since we don't know how many that are, I will use the builder here. However, we probably won't have that many, so using children would probably also be fine. And to mix it up again, I will use list view children here, but you could definitely also use the builder. Now here we need a list of widgets, and actually what we have here, of course, is a list of products which I want to render. But you learned that you can, of course, map the list of data here into a list of widgets. That's something we did a couple of times in this course already. Just need to convert this to a list again with toList. Map takes a function that runs on every item in that list here, so on every product. And now here we need to return a widget, which is then used in our list view here, in that children list in the end. Now, of course, it's up to you how you define a single product you want to render here. I will use a row there because I want to have two elements, two widgets side by side. And I'll add a text widget here, which holds my title. So here on that product for which I'm rendering this, I get the title of the product. And maybe also add a little bit of text style here. And give this a font size of 18 and a font weight of fontweight.bold. Of course, as always, this is up to you. And next to that, I'll add another text widget where I want to output the quantity and the price side by side. So here I'll use string interpolation, use prod quantity, then a times symbol, a x simply, then a $sign which I want to print, hence we need to escape it, and then more string interpolation where I output prod.price. And there I'll also assign some style, a little bit of a different style, however. Set the font size to 18 and the color maybe to colors.gray. Now these are the two text pieces, and on that row I want to add space between, which we can do with main axis alignment, and then main axis alignment dot space between, as you learned. This is how I want to output my list items or the data about the products if we expand that. So let's do a full restart here and now add a couple of items to the cart. Here we should probably fix that now that I see it. In the cart screen here, where I output my total amount, we should use toString as fixed and use two fraction digits here to avoid issues like this. So now let's re-add cart items here. And now if I click order now, and I go to orders, and I click this expand icon, this gets expanded. We see our data here, and we can close this. We can improve the look of that a little bit. For one in order item, I think that is a little bit too big here. And one error here was, I don't want to add plus 100 here, just plus 10. And actually also add some padding, of course, with edge insets symmetric. And maybe have a horizontal padding of 15 and vertical of 4. Whoops. Horizontal 15, vertical 4. So that's one thing, that we add some padding here. And the max size also should be just 100 maybe. So now let's give this one more try. Add a couple of items here to our cart. Click order now. Go to the orders. Go to the orders. Expand this. And now this looks better. You can see we can scroll here if that gets cut off, which is indeed what I want to have as an effect here. And with that, that looks quite nice. We can see what we ordered here. We see the date and we can see more information if we want to. So that's also a nice feature we add to this application. It also emphasizes when you should use stateful widgets and when you should use provided classes, and hopefully also makes it clear what the difference is. And with that, I'd say we have a decent shop here. Definitely not finished. We can't add our own products yet. We'll do that in the next section once we also work more with user interaction, fetch user input, give users different feedback and so on. And there are other nice features which we can add, like saving data in the internet on a server. And these are all things we will add, but hopefully with this module, it got a bit clearer how you may manage your state in bigger applications and why we're doing it like this and how it generally works. So we had a look at state management and there at the provider package in this module. State management is a super important topic because it makes sure that your main Dart file in your main app here stays clean and you don't rebuild the entire app with every little change that might affect some tiny piece in your app. With the provider package, you provide data like objects here. And by the way, that could also be plain strings or numbers, but here it's objects and typically it is objects. You provide objects here with change notifier provider typically, either with value here, with the value constructor, or with the builder function you saw at the beginning of this module. And then anywhere in your app below these providers, so on child widgets here, you can listen to the provided values, either with provider off, like we're doing it here in the orders screen, or with consumer, as we're doing it in the products overview screen. There we're using consumer. The difference between consumer and provider off was that with provider off, you rerun the entire build method here, even if you're in a stateless widget. Actually, that does not matter a bit when you're using provider off in there. Build reruns whenever this changes. Just like as with theme off or media query off, there the build method would also rerun if the data they are connected to changes. It's the same here for the provider. With the consumer, it's a bit different. There you also rerun whenever the data changes, but you only rerun the builder function. So consumer can be nice if you only want to rebuild a part of a widget tree when something changes instead of the entire widget tree. You also learned how to have provided data into another provider, like here product. That also has a change notifier and we can change the favorite status. And we manage our product items here in the products class. And still we can provide both and tap into both. Together with that, you also learned that you don't just have to provide here in your main widget. You can also provide on a lower level, like in our products grid, where we do actually provide our product items here. You learned that you can set listen to false in cases where you really only want to get data one time, or dispatch an action like add order, where you're not interested in the resulting changes and you only just want to dispatch that. Then you can use listen false. And also very important, I explained when you would use the provider pattern or the provider package and provide values application-wide or across multiple widgets at least. And when you would stick to stateful widgets, namely you would always use stateful widgets if you only have state that affects this widget only, or actually even if it's this widget and maybe a child widget, but whenever you don't have state that affects multiple different places in your app that maybe are also distributed quite a bit in the overall widget tree. That's state management. We'll still add more features to this little app because it's a nice demo app that allows us to dig deeper into other concepts too. But I hope that state management is clear here and why the provider package is definitely a package and a pattern you should be aware of.